Who is a recruiter and what do they do?
A recruiter is part of the HR team for any company that you're interested in, really any company. And we are involved with acquiring and searching for top talent in the industry and sometimes outside of the industry, and making sure that they join the company and they're onboarded and they are ready to go. A recruiter is basically somebody who will find the people who apply to roles. People who are actively looking, passively looking. They are the people connectors.
Where was the point where you understood that this profession is for you?
I grew up in a pretty big family. I have 3 older sisters, tons of cousins. I think just being around a lot of people kind of strengthened my EQ, I guess. But I always I just love people. And I always have since I was a little kid. It's just something that I've always enjoyed doing. I didn't even know what a recruiter was when I was in college or even before I graduated from college. But I just knew that I wanted to do something involving people, whether it was sales or working with people with disabilities. There was something about people that I wanted to make an impact on. And, this gave me the opportunity to get involved with somebody's life and make a difference in their life. I think there are certain milestones that you have in life, and it's, getting married, having kids, buying a house, moving, finding a job. Like, those are things that I think are important life events that you'll go through. And this is one of those things that I feel drawn to, where I can connect with a lot of people in a short amount of time. So this was the career for me. I ran track. I played football. I played basketball. I think working as a team helped me understand what it was like to work with people, especially on a team. My first job was working in retail at a company called Olympia Sports. And I think that it's similar to, working at a restaurant, working with, a waiter or waitress. You have to read the room. You have to really get involved with what people want. And that job helped me with that. It helped me just understand that there are going to be a lot of people, and you're going to have to be able to kind of problem solve pretty quick. But that job was fun. I mean, it was my first job ever. And it was a way for me to interact with a lot of people pretty easily.
You studied psychology at University of Massachusetts Lowell. How did this education experience prepare you for your career as a recruiter?
I think when I was at UMass Lowell and taking the psych classes, I think it reminded me that everyone's different. Some of the courses that I took and some of the projects that I did helped me understand more about contingencies. And I did a project where we had 3 cards. You had 3 cards on the table. One was contingent upon you completing a task, like a math problem. Another was based on time. So basically, if you're working, every 30 seconds, you'd get a reward. And then the next one, you would just get a reward no matter what. So the experiment was basically to understand if people would rather work to get a reward, or if they would rather just sit there and not do anything to get a reward. And just from this study, it just found that most people wanted to work to actually get a reward as opposed to just sitting around and not doing anything. So that was before I, again, knew what recruiting was, but it kind of gave me a perspective of people would rather work than be lazy, essentially. So it was fun. I mean, this was just like, 20 adults that we ended up having in this study. But it was fun. It was just interesting to see how people would react. And I know it's different because you're in a room with 3 researchers and you're just by yourself, just doing math problems. So it's a little interesting, but it was fun. That was a nice intro into what it would be like to work with people, as well as, just taking classes. I think even like abnormal psych, you understand the different conditions that people can have. And it's also a reminder that we all wear this invisible backpack that people carry around of their burdens and problems that no one will really know about. And you just have to show people empathy and mercy, just show people that it's okay to have problems and that you can still have people to help you, even though, you might be going through something.
Were there any difficult exams that you had to take?
I think statistics was definitely an interesting because we had to do stats based off of studies that we did within psych. So that was like learning SAS was something that was a little different for me because you go from, concepts and conditions to using the software behind it and how you can use that data. So that was interesting for me to learn. And I think I got more out of that than the like abnormal psych where you're just learning about the conditions, because conditions are conditions. They are what they are. Software, it's moldable. And it's something new, but it's just like any platform that you would see today. It's just learning how to manipulate it to make sure that you have the correct numbers that you need or from a study.
So is that technically data science, what you did back there?
I forget the name of the class, to be honest, but I remember using SAS and learning SAS, and that was different. That was like different from like a typical psych class. It was a specific data platform. To be honest, I can't really remember what it stands for, but yeah, it was a platform that helped you input data, so that way you could actually see the data from, say, like a study. So like during our project, we had to put in that data to actually put into an article and make sure that it was accurate. So that way, when we're putting it into an article, it was something that that people could read easily.
Your first serious job experience was helping people with disabilities to find jobs. What was that like?
It was, I am so happy I got the job. My interview was so bad. I did not know how to interview. It was my first job out of school. I got $30,000 a year, and we had an interview at Panera, and my boss, Pamela, I locked eyes, like I didn't blink, and I didn't know how to interview. So I was really happy that I actually got the job. But it was challenging, but it was also eye-opening to see how some things that we would do for people who don't necessarily have a disability, how easy it is for us compared to somebody who has a developmental disability. Like even just filling out an application, that can be difficult for them, and it can take a lot of time just to write it out. So I would work with students or, adults, like people who were over 18, find jobs. And that went from people with Asperger's to bipolar to schizophrenia, and helping them find jobs because their desire was to be independent and earn their own money. So even just helping them through that process of the basics of just filling out an application, interviewing, understanding what it's like to go to a job, like what bus routes do you need to take to actually get to your work? Is this realistic? Do you even want to do this? Not everyone wants to work at TJ Maxx or work as a dishwasher. So you have to find that middle ground of, what do you want to do? What can you do? What can you get to? So that was an interesting challenge. And I built some really strong relationships with the people that I worked with and their families. And it was amazing to see somebody get to a point where they got a job and they were comfortable and earning money and feeling happy with that. But then you have challenges where, if somebody has an episode at work, they might have to be taken off the job site, and then you're back to square one and finding them a job. So it taught you that, there's certain things that you can't take for granted. And it was very eye-opening. That's what I will say. I was only there for a year, but it taught me a lot for sure.
What was the most common employer reaction for your clients?
It really depends. Some people are very understanding to people who have disabilities. Other people do not understand. And that's okay. Like some people just haven't been exposed to a lot of people with disabilities. But for somebody who has Asperger's and, somebody who, if you've ever met somebody with Asperger's, it can be really awkward. And that's just because they don't pick up on social cues. So having somebody who doesn't understand, they might take it as like, this is going to be really awkward to work with this person. But if they got to know them, it would be actually like one of the most like beneficial things to have, because you're going to get somebody who's super loyal and somebody who is extremely passionate about what they do. Like if they get latched onto something, they are going to stick there for a long time. So for somebody who does understand what it's like to have a disability or somebody who has a disability, those people are very understanding for the most part. It just depends on what the job opening is and, what they have available for that person. It was Work Opportunities Unlimited. I worked there for a little over a year. The outcome was that it gave me a really good foundation for what it's like to help people find a job. But it essentially wasn't for me. When I was at school, I had this idea when I graduated, I'm going to support people with disabilities. And I did for a year, and I realized how challenging it was. And it's not like that for everyone. Like, some people work in social work their entire careers, and they have hearts of gold for sure. Maybe I don't have a heart of gold, maybe I do, but this was, this just wasn't the profession for me. I think the money piece was big for me. I wanted to make more money. I wanted to still impact somebody's life, and recruiting was absolutely the perfect middle ground. But yeah, bare minimum, it gave me a really good foundation for what it's like to work with people.
What was the reason for your transition?
It was challenging. It was too challenging for me. I had to leave. I had to resign, and it was, I think it was for the best. I would want them to have somebody who was all in for them, for the clients, for the people. They don't want somebody who's like burnt out. They need somebody who is like fully in their job.
What was the challenging part? Is it working with people with disabilities? Is that the challenge, or see some failures happen?
I think, sometimes it was working with people with disabilities, but it also helps you take a step back to understand that this is their condition. This is how they live. Like, I can't, I'm sure they wish they didn't have to live with bipolar or schizophrenia. But it was also, like the unknown of getting this far to getting somebody a job just to have them quit 2 weeks later because they thought somebody was talking behind their back because they were washing dishes and they got paranoid about it. So that was challenging. It made me question, what am I doing this work in vain to help these people find a job and then have them, drop off because it's not for them. So that was definitely a challenging part.
And what happened then?
Well, I had a short stint as a leasing agent at a high-rise apartment complex and it's not on my resume, but I did that for about 4 months. And I realized that definitely wasn't for me. I was traveling 2 hours back and forth between Hudson, New Hampshire and Boston each day. And that was enough. And I realized that working as a leasing agent at this particular place, you were always the bad guy. And it was hard. It was hard. I remember there was a guy who, when you're in a high rise, if a pipe bursts, you have to shut off the water in the whole building. And this is a 32, 33 story building. And we had to shut off the water, and this guy came in half shaven, and he had shaving cream on half of his face, and the other half of his face was shaved. And he came in and he started yelling at one of my coworkers, and she was like, I don't know what to tell you. Like, we had to shut off the water. I'm really sorry. But that was kind of a sticking moment for me where, I wish there was something I could do, but there's literally nothing you can do as a leasing agent. But that was kind of like a funny memory for me. But yeah, I think also, the travel was really hard. 2 hours each way was a lot for me. And, my partner at the time was, she was like, hey, I want to spend time with you. And, 4 hours each day, 20 hours a week, just driving was a lot.
Then you transitioned to Aerotech.
I did. Going to Aerotech was a blessing. That was, I was lucky enough to find, or to be selected to go into the scientific division, which was, why I'm here now. My boss, Chris Tamburini, at the time was, he brought me on, he taught me how to recruit. He taught me the skills of what it means to be a recruiter, and how to be a successful recruiter. I think there's a big difference between somebody who can just recruit and somebody who sees the long game. But he was great. He was a great mentor.
So you spent almost 4 years at Aerotech. What was the reason for your transition?
So there's a big difference between agency recruiting and corporate recruiting. Agency recruiting is very much a chase of, looking for those companies that are like really desperate for candidates. And it's more on the sales aspect, which I don't mind, but it's also unpredictable where, you could have a really good candidate, but then have a company just say, no, thanks. Like, see you later. it seemed like you were more adjacent to a company as opposed to being part of a company. And I wanted to be part of a company. And the benefit of working as a recruiter is you get to know which companies are reputable and which companies you should try to stay away from. And Pfizer was one of the companies where I would talk to candidates and they would basically say, no, like I really like it here and I'd rather stay at Pfizer than move. So that's kind of a signal to me to say, okay, if other people really like Pfizer, I should go work at Pfizer. So I was lucky enough to find a job there, and I was there for 5 years working within R&D, and I loved it. It was a really good experience there.
What are the most important skills for someone working in talent acquisition?
You have to be a people person. You have to be someone who can connect with somebody really, really quick. And that's something that I would say to somebody who is considering recruiting, is if you find yourself connecting with somebody really quickly, like within an hour, you might be really good at recruiting. I would say if you can connect with somebody and empathize with someone and feel like you can help them in some way, then recruiting might be for you. I think finding a job can be really rewarding for some people. And if they can utilize their skills to possibly help somebody's life, I work in oncology now, or Takeda Oncology, and I'm placing somebody that could eventually help save someone's life in a way, So that's rewarding to me to be a part of something like that. And that's why I love pharma so much. But yeah, I think if you can connect with somebody, that's the first step to being a good recruiter.
You were in the scientific division at Aerotech, and then you switched to R&D.
Yeah, it's pretty similar. I mean, I would work on a lot of the same type of roles at Aerotech, but then when I transitioned to Pfizer, it was more direct with the company. So instead of working on contract roles, I was working on permanent roles for people right out of school, or people who are mid-career, somebody who's been, a PhD with 10 plus years of experience. It was a pretty wide range. So I just had more ownership in the hiring process when I was at Pfizer, as opposed to when I was at Aerotech. It was more, contract roles and helping fill these gaps within multiple companies. I will say when I was at Aerotech, I had a better sense of the job market. At Pfizer, it was more, and working in within a company can be different because it's more reactive, where people will come to you saying like, hey, I'm looking for this job. This is what I applied to. And it's easier to kind of look for candidates that way. But Aerotech, it's very much outreach. You're reaching out to people who are possibly good and helping them find jobs that way. But yeah, I mean, I think that both have the benefits of supporting people in some way.
If we dive into Pfizer, what was the day like back there?
For a typical day at Pfizer?
Yeah.
Oh man. So I was there from 2017 to 2022. So
you got the COVID hit.
We went through COVID, and it was a lot, but it was important. If you are looking for purpose in work, that was the place to be. But it would be, a lot of what I did at Pfizer is similar to what I'm doing now, but a lot of it is, backfilling positions. So if somebody resigns or moves into a different role, you have to backfill them. So then you're talking to hiring managers, you're talking about what their requirements are, what the qualifications are, what types of candidates they're looking for, and really essentially gauging what kind of candidates would be successful in this role. When I first started, there was they changed CEOs midway through my time there, but their CEO Ian Reed at the time had a rule called "No jerks allowed." So it was very much a kind of a silly thing to say like on a phone screen, but it was also the same thing of talking to somebody over the phone saying like, we take a lot of pride in our culture, meaning like we want people to feel comfortable when they're here. And I liked that because I don't want to hire a jerk. I don't want to hire somebody who would, ruffle feathers of people that they work with. I want to feel comfortable working 40 plus hours with someone, just like I want to hire somebody who's going to work on a team and be comfortable with other people. And I know that's, it's not always going to happen, but I think that was a good goal to have, just hire people that you could easily get along with, that have the technical skills and the EQ to be able to, figure out different situations with people.
How did you know who you have to look for Do you had occasional meetings, and on these meetings you had brainstorming sessions?
Sure.
Whatever?
Yeah. We do kickoff meetings. So whenever we get an open position, we do something called a kickoff meeting, or like an intro meeting, where basically I would introduce myself to a hiring manager, say, hey, I'm your recruiter. Let's talk about this role, figure out what you're looking for, what you're not looking for. So that's where I understand what degrees are okay, what years of experience are okay. If there are any specific websites that they want us to post the position to, what their timeline looks like. I think something that we focus on a lot as recruiters is time to fill. So it's our time from when we post the position to the time that somebody's hired. And we try to make it as quick as possible. And for some roles, it's easier. Some roles, it's harder. Usually executive level positions are more difficult and will take more time. But for like an entry level position, somebody right out of a bachelor's degree, it's usually like, okay, when are they graduating? Let's find, whoever we feel is the best fit, and we can hire them pretty quickly or whenever they graduate. So that's what I would talk to the hiring managers about, is really what they're looking for, what they see as an ideal candidate, and then we go and look for them.
How do you look for them?
So we get applicants. So say, for example, if we have that entry level position, we have maybe 100 candidates. So that's easy to really look through and look to see who would be a good fit. So you look first at, location. If it's a person right out of school, it's probably easier to find somebody locally. So if somebody's out of state, we look at, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, wherever the position is, and then look at their degree. Look at if they've worked at Pfizer before, if they've had internships, if they haven't had internships, what their skills are. So it's really, looking at a resume and just kind of assessing first, hey, are they a fit on paper? Or, and if they are, then we narrow that down to maybe 10 people, 10 people, do a phone screen, narrow that down to 3 or 4 and have them in for an interview, and then narrow that down to one person or however many positions they might have available. So it's very much a filtering process where it starts big and you really narrow it down to, one or, a few people.
What was the transition like from Pfizer?
It's very similar. It's big pharma. Takeda is a Japanese company as opposed to Pfizer being a US company. So, there's small differences, like the fiscal year for Takeda is April through March as opposed to, the regular calendar year with Pfizer, which is, January through December. But I think because I was working in R&D at Pfizer and now I'm in oncology at Takeda, you just understand a little bit more about what's in the pipeline, what's in line for the medications that they have. You really just understand more about the culture and more about what's going on with the company. So that way I know how to talk to a candidate about Takeda and what we have in line for us too.
Would you say there is a big difference between Takeda and Pfizer internally for you?
Internally, that's a good question. I think that the people that I've worked with in pharma everyone has a very similar purpose. And it's either because you've had a personal experience where, like in oncology, a lot of people have experienced cancer themselves or know somebody who's experienced cancer. And this is their way of giving back in some way. Like I'm not a scientist. I'm not going to be working in a lab. I might know what people do, but I'm not going to be out there, packing pills to make sure that somebody gets the right level of medication. But this is like my sister Tina is just recovering from Hodgkin's, and at Takeda we have medication that can help people with leukemia. So that to me, if somebody else is dealing with that, or if somebody else has a sibling or a family member or a friend that's dealing with that, I want to know that they have something to help, and that's not just like the end for them. Like that's such a heavy feeling for somebody to feel, and I think people in pharma feel that level of purpose when they come to work. Even if you're not directly helping someone, you're still feeling that level of responsibility that even though this isn't directly affecting me right now, it could later. And I want to know that I have something to help me. So even if it's not oncology, there's so many different disease areas that pharma touches, and it could be, arthritis, it could be rare diseases, it could be so many different areas, and to be part of something like that can be really rewarding and really, really purposeful.
How did you get up to date with all the terminology?
Time. When I was at Aerotech, I didn't know a lot. That was a big foundation for me, for sure. That's something that I will always take from Aerotech, is that gave me a huge foundation for understanding the lingo, especially within R&D, like analytical chemistry. I didn't know what HPLC was, LCMS, mass spec. There's so many different instruments that I had no idea existed until I was in the scientific division. So it's a lot of Googling. It's a lot of asking questions. A big thing that they told me at Aerotech was ask your candidates what that is, and just be vulnerable and just tell them, hey, I'm new to this. I don't know what, an analytical chemist does. Can you walk me through that? And most of the time, people don't mind talking about what they do. Hopefully they enjoy what they do. So a lot of times people would just tell me, this is what an LCMS is. This is what it measures. This is the type of sample you can feed into it. So just learning from people and Googling and YouTubing, that was a big piece, just like self-learning and learning from other people was a big push when I was at Aerotech.
Why science and pharma?
Oh, it's the purpose. It's people in pharma are super friendly. That is something that I've gotten from my time at Aerotech to the time at Pfizer to my time at Takeda. The people, they're in a lab and they know what their skills are, and they know, people in R&D anyway, they're in a lab and they're making sure that they are doing their best because they're serving patients. That's the biggest takeaway for me, is that we're not serving just us. We're serving patients. We're serving people who absolutely need it. Because if you or I were dealing with cancer, like, we want to know that we have somebody supporting us in some way, right? And that's a huge push for me, is to make sure that, like, I have purposeful work so I can wake up every day knowing that the work that I'm doing is helping someone. That's something that's always been important to me from when I was a kid. I just want to be around helping people and making sure that they're getting what they need. Even if it's not like that sensitive, I just want to make sure that I can support somebody in some way.
Yeah, but you could have go into oil and gas construction, whatever.
Sure.
But you specifically chose science and pharma.
Well, I was lucky at Aerotech to like fall into science.
So it was more luck.
A little bit more luck, yeah. And I'm happy that I stuck with it after Aerotech. But yeah, they after my interview, I walked in and my boss Chris said, "Hey, you're going to be in scientific," and I said, "Great. Where do I start?" I was just happy to have the job, and I was happy to work there. And they told me scientific, and I said, "Great. Let's get going." I think that's also part of my personality, where I kind of just go with the flow, and it worked out really well. But yeah, and then I wanted to stay in pharma because of how much I loved it from my time at Aerotech, and yeah, I'm happy I stuck with it. I'm happy I lucked out that way too.
Let's dive deep into everyday responsibilities. Let's assume you've talked to your division, your hiring manager, and you have an understanding of who they need. You post a job, you use the text, you have like a draft of text, or how's the writing?
Like the job description writing? Yeah. It's so that's established by the hiring manager, the HR team, and compensation. So those three groups will essentially draft a job description, making sure that the education, the years of experience, the qualifications, the responsibilities, everything is aligned for a specific level. So if you're looking for an associate director, there's a certain level of education, there's a certain level of experience that we expect. So if they need somebody with a PharmD or PhD with 5+ years of experience, if you have a PharmD or PhD with 2 years of experience, we can't really consider them. So that way it gives us the scope or the domain of what the recruiters need to look for. So that way when we're looking at resumes, we know what to look for and what not to look for. So after we get the job description prepared, or do you have a question about that?
Yeah, it's just something that resonates with me.
Yeah.
When I see the job postings and they mention a specific amount of years that you have to apply for a job, I always wonder what was the main incentive behind that particular number. When I see 3 years of experience, 5 years of experience, years of experience may be different depending on the company. And in some places it may be more dense. In some places it may be very light. How does one define how much years do you need? Like
Yeah.
3, 5? Is it just a pick in the air?
No, it's very much a calculated, and I should say this is based off of the company. Every company is so different. Like if you look at a smaller company and they don't have that many resources, like if they don't have a comp person, if they don't have an HR person, they probably just look at other job descriptions and just piggyback off of that. I have the luxury of working at a big pharma company where we have a ton of resources. So we can go to comp, we can go to HR, we can go to the job description, or we can go to a hiring manager and say, does this look okay? Does this look like somebody who would qualify for an associate director, or whatever the level might be? So we will, we'll basically come to an agreement like this is what it would take to be an associate director or a director or senior director. And if they don't have this, then they probably won't qualify or they're overqualified. But yeah, there's a few things that would kind of determine that, but it's a very much a collective effort before we even get the job posted.
When you post a job, it's out there. Let's assume LinkedIn, and you have hundreds or even thousands of people applying. How do you browse them? And do you browse them?
We do, yeah, we do browse them. So we can do it a few different ways. So we have AI called Hired Score, and I use this at Pfizer. I use it at Takeda, and this is a software that helps grade resumes based off of the job description. So it has an algorithm that basically says if it has this key terms in a job in a resume, and it matches with the job description, you could be rated an A, or a B, or a C, or a D. And it's not perfect. It's an amazing software. But I've hired people who have a C or a D grade rather than an A or a B. But it helps shortcut what we're looking for. So say you have 100 resumes and you have 20 A's, you start with the A's and look at those and then work your way down. So if out of the 20 A's, you have 10 really good candidates, you show them to the hiring manager, and if they agree or disagree, then you kind of go from there, and then you start reaching out to candidates. So that software absolutely helps. Even without that software, it's you can still look at, if they're local, if they are, meet the qualifications based off of their resume. You can look at a lot of different things, but that's Hired Scores is a helpful tool for sure.
And there is no manual pick, technically. So you always work with Hired Score. You always use the algorithm.
Not always, sometimes, but yeah, a lot of the times we do. Sometimes we have positions that we only post internally. Sometimes we have positions that, if we only have 10 people that apply because it's a very niche role, then you don't necessarily have, you can look through 10 resumes pretty quickly. Give yourself 15 minutes and you could probably figure out which candidates would be good. But if you have a ton of candidates, it's a helpful shortcut. There's also different aspects of that software that can be helpful for reaching out to candidates if there's a very niche role. So if somebody's applied to Takeda in the past, they'll be in the software. They'll be, saved. So if somebody applied a year ago and they're a really good fit for a position now, I can reach out and say, hey, I saw you applied to Takeda in the past. I have this position that I think you'd be a great match for. If you're interested, let's talk. So that is easier for me to understand. All right, this person was interested in Takeda at one point. Maybe if they're interested now, it's worth a reach. It's more of a warmer call than doing what I was doing at Aerotech, which is a cold call, which is like, hey, I don't know if you're actually looking for a job, but if you are looking for a job, I'd love to help you. So it's definitely a warmer, more welcoming, and easier communication.
So technically it saves all the information of all people who applied.
Pretty much, yeah. Not everyone, because if you don't have the software before somebody applies, then they might not be saved. So the sooner you have it, the more people you'll have. So like I said, it's not perfect, but it is an amazing software to help with shortcuts and reaching out to people too.
But what if you have 2,000 or 3,000 applicants for a position?
That's pretty rare. That's more maybe like an internship. Like if you have like one
entry level job.
Sure. I think the most applicants I've ever had, it's probably like 300. And it was probably for an entry level position that had sometimes when I was at Pfizer during COVID, we had a ton of positions because we basically, we needed to hire a lot of people so that way we could utilize the resources that we had at Pfizer to work on the COVID project. And I was lucky enough to support the R&D teams that were supporting the COVID project. So they basically used the people that were there and then hired people to take on the other pipeline projects so they didn't just fall behind. So during those positions, a lot of them were entry level and a lot of these roles had like 5 openings. So you had to basically collect a ton of candidates so that way you can narrow it down to 5. So instead of having, 10 initial calls, you have 20, 30 initial calls just to narrow it down to 5. So as recruiters, we try not to get to that many because you have to review so many resumes. So just the thought of having that many resumes can be exhausting and you have to just work scrolling through resumes all the time. So we try not to get it to that point, but if we do, then, we'll do our best to scroll through.
Do you decline without viewing at any point? Are there any red flags that you see without even opening?
Depends. Like if we can't sponsor someone, like say, the positions in Cambridge, Mass, if we have somebody that lives in another country or indicates that they can't work in the US and we can't offer a relocation package or anything, that's easy for me to say, like, we absolutely can't do a relocation package. We absolutely can't sponsor this candidate. Like that's one of those occasions. And it really just depends on the role. Like if somebody, if we're looking for like a director level position for somebody who has PhD, 10 plus years of experience, if somebody graduated this year with their bachelor's degree, they're absolutely not a fit. So it's more like, okay, you're not a fit. So some of those clear no's, then I mean, I guess I would still have to open up the resume to know that, but that's kind of how we do it. So it's very much like a narrowing of the pool, and that's one of the ways that's easy to narrow it, by disqualifying or dispositioning people that are absolutely not a fit.
And you see the work authorization eligibility without opening them.
Yeah, because usually there's a questionnaire before somebody even applies or adds their resume to say, are you eligible to work in the U.S.? Are you willing to relocate? Questions like that. So when somebody answers those questions, we can see, if somebody's eligible to work in the U.S. And then if somebody needs sponsorship, sometimes we have to dive into what that means because, there's things called OPT for candidates that, are graduating from school and they have 3 years of eligibility. But before that 3 years is up, they can get H-1B, or there's different sponsorships that they can get, O1. Or for somebody in Canada, there's TN. So there's so many different levels of visa depending on where somebody's coming from. So it's a recruiter's responsibility to understand what those requirements are. So that way we know how to support them if they're the best fit. But it just depends on the role. Like some roles you can do it, some roles you can't. It can be costly for some companies to be able to sponsor someone. It can be stressful, like for the candidate and for the companies, because then, what if they aren't sponsored? Then they have to go back to their home country and then we have to find somebody else. So it just depends on the situation.
So you have to know a little bit about migration law too.
A little bit, yeah. And sometimes there's immigration lawyers, or most of the time there's immigration lawyers that get involved to make sure that, we can support them as best we can, so we're not putting them in a bad situation.
Let's imagine you have a job opening that you're working on. As an example, can you take my CV and tell your thoughts straight away? Let's assume we're talking about a role of a project manager or whatever.
Sure.
So first of all, what do you see?
So, I see that you're local. So like starting from the top down. So it says Alex Kellen, Greater Boston. I see that you're local, so that's good. And
Okay, so
then
step one is identifying local or not.
yes, definitely. Because so I need to know, is this person going to need to relocate? Can we offer a relocation package? So we literally start from the top down. So we're like, I think recruiters become, I don't want to say like speed readers, but we're really good at identifying key terms. So like I don't have to read your entire resume line for line, but I can see, like, just scrolling down, I can see Python, artificial intelligence, algorithm, data science, statistics, all in your summary, you know? So like that's already giving me cues for, you know, where your experience lies and where you may be a good fit for. And then you go to experience where you are right now. So that tells me, like, maybe is Alex looking to do this long term? Does he want to continue to be a lecturer while he's working? What's his long-term plan? So this is like what I'm thinking of. And then before you were founder and CEO, do you want to continue doing that? Do you want to be a CEO of your own company? Do you want to be CEO of another company? Do you want to be a project manager? So like these are the things that run through my mind.
If you see that a person is occupied currently, is that a point of concern?
No, people look for roles all the time for all different reasons. You know, especially in biotech. You know, there's layoffs, especially the past 12 to 18 months. There's a layoff almost every month, is what it feels like. So my mind goes to, all right, maybe they're being laid off, or maybe they're trying to get ahead of a layoff. Other times, you know, people just want growth. You know, if you don't get the chance to grow at your current company, you're plateauing, you're not challenging yourself. Some people, or a lot of people, just want to go to a company where they feel like they can still have purpose and also grow professionally. Because if you're stagnant, that's when you fall behind and other people start to leapfrog you in their career. So it just depends on what's important in somebody's career. But yeah, I think it's not a concern at all. I think majority of the people that I talk to are employed or have recently been employed.
So you identify the location of the candidate, you identify if he's employed or not, you identify the crucial skills that I mentioned in the summary, and that's it. You don't go beyond that point.
No, not necessarily. I mean, I'll go here, like, you know, education.
What about
Yeah.
certifications? And if that's not a must-have for the job opening, do you look at those?
Yes. So for example, like I'm working on a role right now at Takeda where having a PMP, or like a project manager certification, and that's a nice to have. So if somebody has it, it's kind of like a green light to me to say, all right, well, this isn't necessary, but because they have a PMP certification, this might look good to the hiring manager. So, you know, in job requirements or in job descriptions, we have basic qualifications and we have preferred qualifications. So preferred just means nice to have. So if they have that, like a lot of the times for Takeda, it's nice to have oncology experience, but if you don't have it, it's okay. But if somebody puts oncology on their experience, then it's, again, a green flag to me to say, okay, they're familiar with this space. So maybe this is, you know, a good fit for them. So let's dive deeper into their resume, or at least have a conversation with them over the phone. So yeah, I absolutely look at the certifications, definitely look at the education, skills. Yeah. Awards I don't necessarily look at. I think maybe like hiring managers might, because they're more in the weeds, you know, like they're more ingrained, like software engineers. Like I'm not a software engineer, but another software engineer might recognize an award or a skill that I'm not familiar with and say they have that software, they can easily do Python, or, you know, something like that. So yeah, it's important to look at it from top down. But yeah, it really does start from the top.
What is the okay amount of certificate? I know it's maybe a dumb question, but what is the okay amount of certifications and skills you should be posting on your profile? I'm asking because there is a pseudo algorithm inside LinkedIn that if you purchase the premium version, then you can see what skills are required for a particular job that the recruiters are looking for, and you can change your profile to artificially meet the requirements to be on the top. So that brings us to the point where people have an absurd amount of skills and certifications just grows wild. And is that a concern if you see a CV and application where you have a lot of
Yeah,
skills?
saturate.
Yeah.
Yeah, you saturate your resume with like these key terms. So if there's a yeah, I mean, I think you want to limit it, but I mean, in terms of like certifications, I feel like that's really helpful to have. And maybe, yeah, you just tailor it. You can just tailor it in your resume just to say like, if they're looking for these key terms, why don't I just put these top 10 and just leave it there? Or top 20, whatever it might look like. But yeah, you don't want to have too much, like where it takes up like half a page. That I think that would be too much. Where it just looks like you're trying to saturate just to like basically get key terms on your resume. But I would say if you know all those things, I think the more important part to me is the experience. Is working chronologically in a resume is how I like to read it. Like how yours is. It goes from most recent down, which I appreciate because it's easy to read that way rather than say these are all my skills and then just make short bullet points of like these are the places that I worked, because then I don't know where you got these skills or how recent they are. I did Boolean searches at Aerotech, which is basically like key term searches, but I don't use that as much now. And if you were to ask me about it, like I could talk about it, but I don't do it as frequently. But I did, 5 years ago. So for somebody reading my resume, if I put Boolean search and they said, "Oh, you can do that every day," I'm like, "Yeah, I could, but I just don't do it all the time." It's kind of like I'm rusty with it. So that's something that I like to see is working chronologically within a resume. So that way I know how recent your experience is.
Could you explain a bit more on the Boolean search? Because if we talk in terms of software engineering, Boolean is a reference for true and false. And you're looking for an exact match, I would assume.
Yeah, exactly. So say, trying to think of an example, but there might be a position or, for research and development, there might be certain key terms like flow cytometry, ELISA. Like there are certain key terms that are like...
You need a solid match for.
Exactly. So you use these terms to basically do what Hired Score is doing. So you use these terms in the education and maybe you put in like local universities. You might put Riviere, you might put UNH, you might put UMass Lowell. And then when you search it, it will only show up with the resumes or the profiles that match what your Boolean search is. So you're narrowing it down based off of education, key terms. So that way anyone who doesn't have these types of skills or background, they just won't show up in your search. So that way you're only searching for the people that show up in your Boolean search. So yeah, you have and terms or terms mainly, and then, a lot of parentheses.
So to conclude on my resume, what are the red flags that you could highlight from there?
Red flags?
The length of the CV, for those who don't see, is around 2 pages roughly.
Yeah, 2.5. I mean, I have no problem with that. Like, I think some resumes have to be long. But in terms of like red flags, I mean, I think you could clean it up a little bit. I think the formatting could be cleaned up. I like to see education at the top, and this is more me having a certain preference for a resume. I like to see, contact information at the top, summary or skills, like as one, and then education, experience, and then certs at the bottom if you want, like any add-ons. Definitely for anyone who's listening to this, please don't put hobbies. You can talk about it in an interview, but don't put it on your resume. It's totally unnecessary. And I love that people love to hike. I love to hike, but I'm not going to put it on my resume. It's good to like talk about in conversation. And you don't have hobbies on your resume, and that's not why I'm saying it. But like, I just want to emphasize that because every time I see it, I'm like, we don't need to know this. But yeah, I mean, I think I'm more of, I'm nitpicky about like format, but like, I can still read your resume. Like I still know what your background is. But just formatting, that's all.
I'm personally the type of person who would not try and think of lying on the CV. There are a lot of people who overemphasize their previous jobs and previous experiences that they've literally just saved the planet every day, and now they're looking for a job. That is one approach. And the other approach is just be plain and straight and short. Which ones work better?
Overall, plain and straight and short. Overemphasizing or like fluffing up your resume, like it can only, it just depends. Like marketing, you kind of have to be fluffy. You kind of have to be like, you have to wow somebody with your formatting, right? Or like the way that you
sell yourself.
Sure. For the positions that I work on, and honestly, like really any resume, the more straightforward it is, the easier it is for me to identify. The more fancy you get with your resume, or the busier it looks, doesn't impress me. I'm more impressed about the person. I really just want to get to know the person. And sometimes the resume can tell you about the person and how they like to format, but it's more important to me to know what those hard skills are, because soft skills come from your interactions. You know, like some positions you don't need any soft skills, where you're just literally on your own, just working on a computer, and you don't interact with anyone. And then there's other roles like mine where I have to work with people every single day, and that's not going to come through on a resume. I can't just put I'm a people person on my resume. I guess I could, but there's only one way to prove that, and that's in, interactions, whether it's a Teams call or a phone call or a real in-person interaction. But I am very much for a straightforward resume where I just know what your hard skills are and we can assess your soft skills over the phone.
What if it is a position that does not have a lot of hard skills requirements?
It's more about strategy. I want to know about strategy and, software. Like for me, like it would be, have I worked with HiredScore? I work with Workday, which is our applicant tracking system, and where we put offers through. What you're familiar with is helpful. And then even just putting dates on there, understanding how long somebody's worked at a place, what your title is. That's also really important, because then I want to know, what level they're okay with. And I know titling is a whole different subject, but every company is different with how they title. Like a smaller company, you're probably going to inflate the titles a lot. Bigger companies, you need to have a lot of structure around the title, just because you need to know, if somebody is a director, but they only have 2 years out of school, that's probably a smaller company, because it's like no one gets to a director level after 2 years for the most part, at a big company.
But even then, when you look at the job description, people usually do that evening-wise, spend a lot of hours browsing through various job applications, often getting to the point of the desperation of just applying for almost anything they see, everything that is sort of a match. When you see these job requirements that are often very high for a lot of people, because it is understandable that companies want to have more experienced, more qualified personnel, preferably for a smaller pay, what would you tell to those people who do not reach to that limit that is established?
I think the first step is always important to look at the qualifications. I think on occasion there's flexibility at a company to say, we're looking for 5, but it's not in the posting. Like, hey, if you have 3, maybe we can still consider you. Some positions are flexible, some are not, and you won't necessarily know that looking at a position. So it doesn't hurt to stretch it a little bit, because if you're a really good candidate, but you have 4 years instead of 5, maybe there's flexibility from the company to be able to work with you. Other times, I'm not saying that all the time, but on occasion you can do that. And it still gets your name there, like to get your name within a database at a company is also important, because then you look back to HiredScore and then you have your name in their database. And then you can reach out, or have a recruiter reach out to you later on to say, hey, you applied to Takeda in the past. What do you think about this role? So I don't think it hurts. I think to oversaturate and become like what we call like a serial applicant can hurt you. Because if I look at a candidate and I see that they've applied to 500 roles, that's kind of a stretch. But like if you apply to that many roles at one company, that can look like you're not intentional about the positions that you're applying to. It looks more like you just want to get in with the company. You don't really care where it is. And then it kind of is a red flag to recruiters to say, okay, like, are you actually interested in this role? Or are you more, thinking about just getting in and then kind of moving around when you're here. So being intentional is very, very important. I think if you're applying to those stretch positions where you're not necessarily qualified, it's okay to do that, but just be selective about it.
But on the other side, if they go through the algorithm, you'll probably not see them.
If they're applying, well, yeah, depending. Because the algorithm will look at whether they're local, whether they have all the key terms in their resume, where they've worked. They look at a ton. Like I don't know the exact algorithm, but they look at, I shouldn't say they, but it looks at, a lot of different things that can be supportive. So even if you don't like necessarily meet the qualification, you might make a B instead of an A, just to say like they don't meet the years, but they have a lot of what you're looking for.
Let's assume you got through the CV, and now comes the next step. You have to talk to the person. You send an invitation for a talk, and what happens then?
On
your side.
Yeah, we will talk and assess a lot of the soft skills. A lot of times these hiring managers, especially if it's a people-facing candidate, we need to know that they either have executive presence or if they're just a people person, if they're easy to get along with. Other times it's all about hard skills. It doesn't matter at all what their soft skills are. So it's more about, okay, tell me about this experience. Tell me about this software. Tell me about a time that you had to use the software and what projects was it for? Tell me about your oncology experience. A lot of it is just understanding their situation. Why are you looking? If they were laid off, like how's your job search going? Or even just asking how their job search is going in general. Do you have offers? Do you have other interviews going on? Do you need to move? Do you need sponsorship? Those types of like check the box kind of questions to understand what their situation is. Because if I don't ask that, or if I don't ask what their salary expectations are, then, they could be way out of the range. Like if somebody's asking for $200,000 and we can offer 150, are they flexible? Are they even worth pursuing? Because if they're looking for too much money, I don't want to waste their time. We don't want to waste our time. So it's very much a pre-screen to understand if it's worth going to the next step. So that way the manager can talk to them and assess their skills too.
We skipped a step of salary identification. Now, when you fill out the application, sometimes you're asked, what is your desired level of pay? And that is a tricky question for, I think, a lot of people. Mm-hmm. What if you know on average what the industry standard is? You can go through Glassdoor and take a sneak peek what the number technically could be there, but that's just an estimate. What is the strategy that you would advise? Because a lot of people think that, okay, if I put in less than they think of a certain amount in their head, then I'm going to be doubling down. I'm going to be cheap in their eyes. But if I put a lot, they will say, no, we cannot afford and not even talk to me.
Sure.
So what is the approach here?
It is tricky, but I will say my personal approach is if I had a specific number that I absolutely need to hit, don't shy away from it. If you need $200,000 to survive, go for $200,000. If it's not necessarily that important to you and it's more about the position and more about the experience, just put NA. Just don't even put a number if you have that option, and talk to them about it. Because most of the time, like what I'll do is I will give the range. So I'll give the range to a candidate and I will basically show my cards first to say, all right, this is our compensation. This is our base. This is our bonus. This is our long-term incentive. Does this meet what you're hoping for? And they'll say yes or no. Hey, maybe I'm on the upper end, or maybe, this is what I'm making now. We can't ask how much somebody's making unless we're at the offer stage. So that's literally the only time that we can ask somebody how much they're making. If somebody reveals that to us, that's up to them. And we can share, hey, this is realistically what we can pay. If you're comfortable with that, then, let's proceed to the next step, or, whatever the next step might be. So it can be a tricky one, but it's also there to make sure that we're not wasting anyone's time. That's the last thing that I want to do, is bring somebody through an interview process just to, cut them down $50,000 more than what they were expecting. Like that would hurt them. It would hurt me. It would hurt my reputation as a recruiter to say to the hiring managers, like, hey, sorry, like we didn't meet their expectations and I didn't know that from the beginning. That would be on me. And I don't want that. So I want to make sure that I'm setting somebody up for success from a position standpoint and from a financial standpoint. And luckily in pharma, I think we do a pretty good job of paying people pretty well.
And what if you have two candidates? One is asking 50,000 more, and the other one is a bit is not that qualified as the first one. Does money account more in the decision making?
Not necessarily. At least so my experience as a recruiter, that hasn't like made hiring managers shy away from one or the other. I think it's more about who has the higher ceiling, who can contribute, who can be a good fit for this group. And if it's the person with less experience, then it's the person with less experience. Maybe they interview better. But if it's the person that's more expensive and they're the better fit for that group, then they'll just go that way, you know? And sometimes you have a backup candidate. Sometimes you'll have an A and a B candidate and everyone really likes both of them. So you just start with the A candidate, see what they think. If they decline, you go to the B candidate and say, hey, let's see if they want to accept an offer too.
What is the math for determining eligibility for a position? For example, assume you have a candidate who's asking for 100,000 and your job opening is for 60,000.
Mm-hmm.
He's asking for a lot more than what you can offer. Would that be a reason for you to silently cut him off without even starting a conversation? If you see a number that is significantly bigger than the one that you have in your budget or whatever, is that a reason for you to just cut him off silently and send the silent no email? Thank you, we've looked through your...
Sure, yeah. It depends on if they're qualified. If the person is qualified, I think it's worth a conversation. And that's what I always say to the hiring manager. You know, even though if their salary expectations in their application are $40,000 over, I would say let's still have the conversation because, again, they are just expectations. They're not like, hey, I absolutely have to have this until you talk to someone. So that's like the big message for the hiring managers is that you don't know until we know. So if that was the case, I would just tell the person over the phone, like, hey, realistically, we can really only pay 60,000. I saw you put 100,000. How do you feel about this? And just have a straight up conversation with them. You know, I am very much about being efficient and making sure that the people that are coming through are worth it for the hiring manager and worth it for the candidate. Because if somebody's looking for 100,000, like, go get it. You know, like that's awesome. Like, I hope you get it. But realistically, and like sometimes I've had to have these realistic conversations with candidates, especially right out of school, where, you know, hey, maybe they pay 65,000 for a position, and if you're looking for 80, like you can try to go get it, but I just don't know where you're going to get it, depending on the role. So it's more just helping them understand and educating them to say, I understand where you're coming from, and I hope that you can get that. But here, this is realistically what you can get. We can offer a base, we can offer a bonus, we can offer this time off. Like, the benefits are amazing, but you know, this is realistically what we can do. So think about it, get back to me. You know, I'm not here to control somebody's life. I'm really here to just paint the picture. And then if they decide to say yes, then we go for it. And if not, you know, maybe we connect on something else.
So you're saying that if we take the standard deviation of 50% from what you have established as budget, even if it is more by 50% than the sum, you will still go and talk to that person if he's qualified.
Yeah. I think to be a good recruiter, you have to play the long game. You have to understand that it just because it's not for one role doesn't mean that it's not for another role. And if you are establishing solid relationships with people, you're doing a good job as a recruiter. I talk to people. I just talked to somebody today that I haven't talked to in 2 years. And it was somebody that I worked with at Pfizer, basically to say like, hey, I might be laid off and I would love to like learn more about what it's like to work at Takeda, just in case that happens. So even just building a relationship is super important. And that person, like I met at a career fair, and she ended up getting a position through Pfizer, not through me, but she got a job at Pfizer. And I was like, yeah, of course. Like, let's have a conversation. If I'd love to help you out if you want to work at Takeda. And I wouldn't want to be laid off, like I would hope somebody would want to help me if I was being laid off. Right. So it's just, people helping people.
But at the same time, if you have 3 candidates that hit the budget that are qualified,
Sure.
and you have the 4th one who asks more, that would be a no-brainer to cut him off because you have others who are qualified.
Sure. Not necessarily to cut him off, but I would still, if that person was absolutely the A candidate.
Well, archive him, but not directly.
Sure. But if they really were the best candidate, I would still approach them first to say, hey, we want to make you an offer, but this is what we can offer. What do you think? And really leave it up to them. Because, again, like I'm not here to tell somebody like what their salary would be okay or what they would be okay with for a salary. So if they say that that's okay and we make them an offer and they accept, then perfect. But if they say no, then, no harm, no foul. It's more like, hey, we'll find you something that maybe later that meets your expectations. And then we go to somebody else, like those other 3 candidates, to say, all right, who's our top candidate out of these 3?
And what about the time of application? If there are, if the job posting is open for a few weeks or even months.
Yeah.
And you have a lot of applicants going through, is there any law, an internal law that guides you that that person applied first, he gets to go, and that one applied last, he gets to go last?
No, not at all. It's more, it's up to the responsibility of the recruiter to make sure that we are looking through resumes pretty frequently. So if you have a rec load of 20 recs.
What is a rec?
Sorry, a requisition. So it's like a job. It's essentially what I call it rec, but it means requisition or like a specific job that I'm working on. So a lot of the times they'll have like a number attached to it. I think they call it a rec when you give blood too. Like it's a job. Like this is like your specific blood and you have to get like cholesterol done, whatever it is. So we call it the same thing, a requisition. So if you have 20 recs, it's the responsibility of the recruiter to keep an eye on all of them to know which ones are at the offer stage, which one is right at the beginning, which one needs to like cut off the posting because we have 100 candidates. It's up to the recruiter to do that. But it doesn't matter if you're the first one to apply or the last one to apply. If you're the most qualified, that's really the most important to us.
Yeah, but the algorithm does the job for you in any way.
Hired Score does, yeah. It will still grade them regardless of when they apply, but that won't knock them. Like if they're the last person to apply, it won't give them like a knock on a grade or something, yeah.
Do you prepare for the interview on your side? Obviously you do, but it has to be more of a routine thing for you. You know how to do this. You've done this like maybe 1,000 times.
Yeah, it's more like my preparation is different than somebody who's like a hiring manager or somebody who's going to be working in partnership with this person because they're going to ask more questions around, tell me about a time that you dealt with a difficult issue and how you got through it. So they'll ask a lot of questions like that, a lot of strategic questions, a lot of technical questions. They'll really assess, am I going to be comfortable working with this person 40 hours a week or more? You want to make sure that this person's going to perform at a high level, that they are going to be somebody that you're comfortable working with on a frequent basis. Because sometimes personality can be a big difference maker for whether you're going to be getting the role or not. And that can be the kicker. That can be literally the only difference between one person and another. Like this person's really hungry and they want this and they have exactly the same skills as candidate B. Let's go with the person that's hungry and the person that like really shows that they want to be here. So my preparation is a lot different. Mine is more reassessing along the timeline. Like, hey, the last time we spoke, you had 2 interviews set up. How's it going now? Do you have offers? Did they fall through? Like what's going on now? How are you doing? So mine is more of like a check base to say, like, how are you doing? Do you have questions that have been unanswered? Mine is more of like a pulse check than a like assessment because my assessment is like very early on before they even talk to the hiring manager.
But still you can cut off.
Oh yeah. Yeah. We can still cut off at certain points. Like even after the hiring manager talks to them, they can say, hey, they don't have enough commercial experience. So, let's look for somebody who has more of that. So it really just depends. It depends on the role. It depends on the hiring manager. It depends on the candidate. There's a lot. that goes into it.
Can you give an example of a cutoff on your stage?
If they can't relocate, so one of our policies that we have is that we have to have somebody come into the site twice a week. And if you can't do that, then we can't consider you. So that's usually a cutoff. And again, I will continue to have that relationship with that person just to say like, hey, if that changes and you want to relocate to Boston, like let's revisit and keep that relationship alive. And if the pay rate is off, like if somebody was say looking for $200,000, we can offer 100, and they say, hey, I can't do that. That's totally fine. Like let's talk when there's another role that's a higher salary. So that's usually a pretty easy cutoff.
Would you advise people to risk more in terms of negotiating for a higher salary? Or can it be a future problem for the applicants if they go down that way?
Right. It depends. Depends on how much you push. I am all about negotiating.
Well, if you know, for example, that the job is open for 100K and the applicant is looking for 115 or 120,
Mm-hmm.
It is substantial, but it's not that for a pharma company. What would your advice be in this case?
I think if it's worth it for them career-wise, and they feel like you have to really assess if you can't negotiate beyond that point and you still try and you still can't, then you really have to assess like even a second time to say, all right, am I going to be comfortable with this money?
I mean, try initially, not.
Oh, initially?
Yeah, initially.
I think that's too early to say, because it's like it's also up to the recruiter to paint the picture of a realistic offer, right? Because if you try to negotiate too early, that would be a cue to me or the hiring manager to say like, all right, they're getting ahead of themselves. Like they're feeling like they already got this job and we haven't even like gotten to an interview, right? But I think that like just like there's scope in, or like there's a domain for what we have for a range. And if we explain that and there's not really much room to negotiate, then it's on the candidate at that point, because we have a job internally to make sure that we are being equitable, right? Like we don't want to tip the scales one way or the other. We don't want to underpay somebody. We don't want to overpay somebody and have everyone else in the group, sit there at X number, right? So we have to make sure that we're being fair to the people that are there and we're being fair to the people that are coming in too. So I think negotiating too early can probably hurt a candidate.
But not negotiating at all.
Yeah, I mean, I think when somebody gets an offer, there are very limited opportunities in your career to be able to negotiate. When you're with a company, it's even harder to negotiate. So I'm surprised when people don't negotiate. I don't tell people to negotiate, but if somebody were to say like, hey, what do you think about, this number instead of this number? I always say, let me check. I'll see. It's worth a shot, because I do the same thing for myself and I treat candidates as if it were me. Like if I was in their shoes, I would do the same thing. And the worst thing that somebody could say is no. Best thing somebody can say is yes. Like, let's negotiate, let's bump it up, let's make you happy, So I believe that it's important for people to negotiate. It's not something that has to be like a super clunky thing. It can just be like, hey, I'm really hoping for this. What do you think? Other times you can really like justify why you feel like you can get a raise, but it just depends on who you're talking to, I guess. But I think the least you can do is ask.
So asking will not hurt you?
No, at least once. I mean, if you push too much, then it might hurt you. Like I've had some cases where candidates push, 3 or 4 times like, hey, I really need a higher salary. And when there's really nothing you can do, then it gets to be like a nag for the hiring manager and for the team to say, all right, well, are you more involved in the money, or are you more involved in the position? Which one is more important to you? And that's where they start to wonder, all right, are they only in this for the money? So too much negotiating can hurt, but once or twice is okay.
It always seemed complicated. It always seemed as a complicated process for me, because you have to talk to a person, you have to explain to him his future in a hypothetical manner. Like, imagine X amount of people you're going to be doing Y amount of job, and you're going to be attending that Z amount of days a week. And for that, we're going to pay you this amount. This is so theoretical. This is so hypothetical. And on practice, it may be actually even harder than they say or easier than they say. What would your advice be for future applicants to define how accurate the job description is actually to the actual position?
Sure. Ask a lot of questions. When you get somebody on the phone, a recruiter or hiring manager, ask as many questions as you possibly can. Maybe not like overdo it, but at least have 3 to 5 questions that can really help you understand the role. Usually, it's a call with the recruiter, and the recruiter will kind of paint the picture, like surface level. This is what you can expect. Then, if you talk to the hiring manager, they go deeper into what they're really hoping for, like what hard skills they're looking for, what's a typical day. What would you recommend for somebody starting out in this role? How can they be successful? Basic questions like that can really give them a sense of what it's like to work there. And talking to people in an interview, some people that could potentially be your coworkers, those are the best people to talk to because they're the ones doing the job. Hey, tell me about what you do on a daily basis. What's your Monday look like? What do you do to prepare? Different questions like that can absolutely help you paint the picture of what it's like to work at a company. And if you don't ask questions, then you can potentially go in blind. You might not have any idea of what it's like to work there.
Yeah, but at the end of the day, it is some sort of a guess game because the person comes in relatively blindly, not knowing you personally and the
Sure.
company and the team, and you see him for the first time. You don't know anything about him, only from his CV, and that's where this interaction starts. And you have a limited amount of time to define, hypothetically, is that a fit or not. And people can start to behave weirdly.
Mm-hmm.
Can you share some of those experiences?
Yeah, I think
When people try to be, for example, like extra friendly or extra shy, or just
I know. So one of the intangible skills that a recruiter has is their gut, and it's kind of it's something that, like, again, you just wouldn't put on your resume. You can't put in your skills. I have a great gut. Like I don't have like these elite instincts, but like you really do as a recruiter. You talk to enough people to know if somebody's like BSing you, to basically be like, you're putting on a show. Like no one's this friendly. Some people are. I've talked to some people that smile every day. They're probably the most positive people in the world. But then there are other people that can show their true colors after a certain time. Like if they're put under a certain stressful situation, like going into an interview. Going into an interview can be really, really stressful for some people because it's you under a spotlight and no one's there to like back you up, unless like you've worked with somebody previously that can kind of like vouch for you. But that's definitely something that a recruiter has to do. If somebody else is kind of like falling for that, it doesn't happen all the time. And I think that's also why I really like pharma. I think people are very, very straightforward. And not to take anything away from other industries. That's just what I'm familiar with. But I think it's also the job of a recruiter to really say like, hey, there's something weird. Like there's something going on with this candidate. I think they were kind of like polishing their answers a little bit too much, or they seem too scripted, or it doesn't really seem like they're coming from the heart. It just seems like they're just reading you what you want to hear.
But at the same time, you're looking to evaluate the soft skills.
Oh, yeah.
And you are evaluating the past experience and some technical knowledge, as you mentioned. And at the same time, you're not a scientist to
Right.
How do you judge the level of knowledge? Do you have like pre-made questions that you ask the candidate with the fixed answers?
Sometimes, yeah. Well, I'm not looking for specific answers necessarily, but when I do my kickoff meeting with the hiring manager, I say, what's 1 or 2 questions that you want me to ask the candidate to really assess if they have the skills for what you're looking for. So sometimes that can give me a sense of, this is what their answer was. And that's why we have so many eyes on these candidates, because if it was just me hiring a scientist, I probably wouldn't be as successful as I have been, because I really do need the help of scientists, because they're in there. They know what it's like to pipette. The last time I used the pipette was in lab in biology at school. A pipette is like something that you use to like, do like a 96 panel, or like it's something that you have a liquid and you just like kind of squeeze into like a little platelet. But I'm not in there doing that. I'm not in the weeds like a scientist is. And they're going to know, just like somebody who is like a painting enthusiast, if they see like a real painting all the time, they're going to be able to tell like the fake ones, and that's what they're doing for me. They're telling me, hey, this person's good on paper, but I think they would struggle with this for X, Y, and Z. So that's why we do interviews. And then after interviews, we have a debrief to talk about it with the team, because sometimes you have slam dunk candidates where they meet all the qualifications, they meet all the soft skills, they presented really well, they seem genuine. That's why we have so many people go through these processes, because the more eyes you have on it, the more likely you are to have somebody pick up on a red flag, if there is a red flag. But yeah, I know interviewing has always been such an interesting process for me, because there's no other way of assessing people. Like there's no way of like grading somebody before you even get into a job to say, yeah, we know you'd be a good fit because you took this assessment, right? There's nothing like that. There's nothing like an interview that can help you assess. So it's an interesting process, but it's the best we have so far. And it works. It works pretty well.
What if you have candidates that are too nervous on an interview? Do you give them a second chance, or is that a cutoff?
No, it's not necessarily cut off, but it happens. But you try to do your best to like prepare them. Like I think when I was at Aerotech, I had to prepare a lot of like new grads, like inexperienced interviewers, and hopefully people don't have to interview all the time, unless you're a recruiter, because you're just involved in it all the time. But hopefully in your lifetime, there's only certain spurts of your career where you have to really interview all the time. But yeah, some people can be really nervous, and it can be a red flag in some cases. If it's an entry-level position, maybe we cut them some slack to be like, all right, maybe this is their first interview and they really want the job. Like I think there's a certain level of nerves that's okay. Because you're talking to people, and like some people are just very socially nervous around people that they don't know. So you have to give them a little bit of slack to be like, all right, you have really sweaty hands, but you have really good skills, and I think you're a genuine person, So there's things that like you can let slide, and then there's like the other end where it's like, there's also like another way of saying like, all right, this person's like really nervous. Like, are they going to be like this all the time? Because we need somebody who can like kind of handle a little bit of pressure. So yeah, just like the interview itself is assessing, if somebody can handle a little bit of pressure.
So once you're done with your interview with the candidate, while you interview, you make notes.
Oh yeah.
What do you write there? Because you have to retell the story later.
Yeah.
Like your experience with that candidate.
Well, I will write down, when I take my notes, it's really, again, like reestablishing what their situation is. Like if I need to tell the team this person has 2 other interviews going on, or they are expecting an offer, so we really need to make a decision quickly, and add a little bit of the sense of a timeline for the team to say, if you really want this candidate, we have to move fast. And if you don't, that's fine. Let's just figure out what we want to do so I can relay that to the candidate. Because my job also, on top of, making offers, I also have to let people know if they're not getting an offer, so that way we're not like hanging on to them. Because I think from a candidate's experience, it's really difficult to wait. And I know what that feeling was like, because even just like waiting for my news for Aerotech, for Pfizer, for Takeda, just the waiting game and not knowing if you're going to be getting an offer can make you nervous and make you like really anxious to find out. So my notes are really around, what their answers were, if there were any red flags. So that way, if I write it down when we talk about the debrief, I can say like, well, this is the answer that they gave me. Did they give you the same answer? And compare notes. And then sometimes it could be a red flag. Sometimes it's more like, no, they explained it. It's okay. So my notes are more about their personal situation to understand what I can do to help.
Is it appropriate to get a reminder from a candidate if you haven't heard about the job for a week or two, or even more? Is it fine to reach out to you?
It is. Yeah. I actually hope for people to reach out because then it shows me that they're interested. But yeah, it's totally fine. If it's a week, if it's sometimes I give timelines to the candidate to say, hey, if you haven't heard from me in a week, it's okay if you reach out. Usually I have weekly meetings with the hiring managers anyway, just to understand where their head's at, to move candidates forward or cut certain candidates off. It just kind of depends on how that meeting goes. So yeah, totally fine if they reach out.
When people are looking for a job and they're interviewing in places, they don't usually go for an interview in one single place. Do you keep in your head and understand that these people may be taken away before you go through the decision-making process? And did you have those situations?
I have one currently. It happens all the time. I think the job market can have ebbs and flows. So there are certain times where the candidate market and the job market is very different. It's very much a supply and demand. So sometimes, like for example, during COVID, there were tons of jobs and tons of candidates looking. So it was like a perfect match. It was like, all right, you have 70 roles and 100 people looking. So it's like, let's go make some hires. Then you have the opposite end where you have a ton of candidates but not a lot of openings. So then you have a lot of people applying, but then you only hire one person. So it's a lot of like narrowing down. So sorry, I lost my train of thought. But yeah, I think
Losing a candidate.
thank you. Yeah, it happens all the time. So I have a candidate right now that is expecting an offer this week, but the last interview doesn't go off until next Tuesday. So it's possible that they might have to either make a decision on another offer or they can stall on that offer to wait for us. So it's kind of that limbo that you run into with some candidates that you might lose or you might be able to hang on to find out if we are going to make an offer to kind of compete with these other companies. But happens more than you think.
So it is okay for a candidate to inform you that he has other offers.
I would prefer it. Yeah. Yeah. If he or she is like, hey, I have 3 offers on the table and I need to make a decision in a week, then, I have to put that timeline on the team to say, hey, if you want to make that decision, like we might lose them, but if there's any way that you want to proceed with them, then like let's go, let's do what we have to do. So it's the recruiter's job to really have a pulse check to make sure that like the candidate knows what the timeline is from the company side and the company knows what the timeline is from the candidate side. Because if we want to proceed, we're going to have to move quick for some people.
Did you have situations where people try to manipulate the situation with artificially presenting that they have other offers, even they don't?
Yeah, sometimes, yeah. Yes. Unfortunately, there's that cynical side of me that knows that happens. I don't think it happens that often, but when it does, it nags at me. But yeah, sometimes people use interviews to leverage an offer at their current company. And again, this does not happen a lot. This has happened to me maybe like 5 times. So, once every 2 years. But yeah, every once in a while they'll negotiate a lot, and then they'll say, no, I'm going to decide to stay with my current company. They offered me a different position. It's like, okay, now I know what you did. It is what it is. Like people have their own prerogatives, and I can't really control that. But
any hard feelings?
Yeah, a little bit. I do. I unfortunately do. I think as a recruiter, like I said, like I play the long game, and I remember that stuff. Like that's all I'll say is like I remember when people will do things like that, and the next time that they try to get a job with me, I'm going to remember. And it's not a good situation for anyone, because then it's like, all right, well, are you just going to do the same thing? Like maybe you're a really good candidate, but are you really only in this for the money? So sometimes, and again, very rare, but yeah, it'll happen.
When you interview people, do you use different strategies to interview people? For example, there are some that I've read of. There are some strategies where you push the candidate to see if they crack in terms of stress, implicating pressure while you ask questions, doing that intentionally to see if how's the person doing under stress? Do you do that?
Not necessarily. I mean, I personally think that interviews can be a stressful situation by itself without even having the questions. But I think that for some roles, there can be a lot of pressure. I think sales to me is a high pressure job, especially in pharma. Like I had to hire 9 salespeople earlier this year. Basically, when I started at Takeda, I was on a project to help with these sales positions, and I know that sales has a lot of numbers around it, and there has to be a certain track record from a candidate to show that, you know, their numbers have been proven to be like, maybe they were number one in their company for a certain quarter or something. Like that's pressure to me. And there's also, you know, executive roles where pressure is kind of implied because you're a leader. You know, being a leader comes with a lot of pressure too, because you have direct reports that rely on you. So showing that or giving examples of that is super important, because if you don't have examples, or if you can't like pull from an experience, it's hard to justify a hire. You know, like you have to be able to show that to different levels of people, different people that you'd be working with. You have to show, you know, hey, I belong here, you know, and doing that in a very short amount of time, that's pressure. You know, there's only so many people that you talk to in an interview. And if you let that pressure get to you in an interview, then it will probably get to you in the job. You know, I think I can't remember who told me this, but how you do anything is how you do everything. And that's why, you know, an interview is just a small sample, you know, like this is how you're going to do everything. And I know it's like a small sample size. You can't like work in an interview, but it's a small sample of what this person would look like at the job.
During an interview, people have to share their past experiences in their previous jobs. How do you define if someone is misleading you or over qualifying himself artificially just to push him up?
Yeah, that happens all the time.
How do you see that?
I think a lot of people kind of brandish like their experience, where it's like, yeah, I'm the perfect match. You know, like they basically, like, some people just sell themselves really well and some people oversell themselves. I think some roles it can be okay. Like, again, we go back to like sales positions, like they have to sell something all the time, right? So they're going to sell themselves really well. And that's the tricky part about hiring a salesperson, is that every salesperson is really, really good in their eyes, right? And a lot of salespeople are really good. And I think that the biggest differentiator is how they connect and how they can reach to experiences, personal experiences, and be vulnerable. And the people who aren't vulnerable, it's really easy to tell. That's something that like is a cue to me. You know, somebody who's working in oncology and somebody who's dealt with cancer, that's a vulnerability. Like when I was working on those roles, there were, you know, multiple women who said that they battled breast cancer and they beat cancer, and that's what motivated them to get into oncology. And to me, that's an inspirational story that can really connect with a doctor or a nurse or a pharmacist that you have to talk to. And if you can sell that to me, and I'm not even like looking to like get a pharmaceutical drug, that means that you can most likely connect with somebody else. So that when somebody's trying to like overstep their experience, I think that it can be obvious, but other times it can come through if like they can't reach back to like any personal experience or show that vulnerability, then that's kind of a big differentiator for me.
The tricky part here is that the applicants, they submit their CV, which they probably spent more than 40 minutes or even an hour polishing for the recruiter to see. And when the conversation begins, how do you usually begin your conversation? Do you expect the person just to start rolling, okay, tell me your story? Like, okay, I was born there and then I got the job, whatever.
Sure.
How does that happen?
I usually try to break the ice. I think everyone's like a little different when you first start talking to them. I think some people are real natural connectors. Other people aren't really naturally social with other people. So I usually start off like, hey, how's your Friday going? Like, how are you doing? Just to try to like break the ice a little bit. And then, I know that I want to be respectful of their time too. So you really only have a 30-minute window to be able to really understand more about that person. So I try to, maybe not spend more than 5 minutes, talking to them. But if like we're both kind of talking about like, oh, were you at the beach this Saturday? Oh my God, it was so crowded. Like you can just go off on tangents. But other times it's more like, all right, like let's talk about you. Let's talk about your experience. Why are you interested? How'd you hear about the role? Do you know anyone here? There's certain like soft questions that kind of warm people up, and that kind of helps. In my opinion, I mean, I think my conversations go pretty easily, and mine are more, I'm somewhat of a gatekeeper to say, if you get past this call, you'll talk to the hiring manager. Like, I'd love for you to talk to them. So it just depends. It depends on the person, but I very much try to start off soft to just say like, hey, it doesn't have to be all business. Like, I want you to get a good feel for what this company is, because a lot of the times I'm the first person somebody's talking to from Takeda. So if they don't get a good impression from me, they might not want to move forward. So I want to leave a good impression. I want to, have a good reputation for myself so people know who I am. And I don't want that to come across as harsh. And I don't think I'm a harsh person, hopefully. But yeah, so that's usually how I start off my conversations. It's like starting off soft and then getting into like the nitty gritty of their experience.
Would you say that your job is like a sales job?
Yes, it's. I've always described it as a mix between HR and sales. And I have a really good friend that's in software sales, and he always told me that he felt like my job was more complex because selling a product compared to like selling somebody's experience is very different, because people are complex and products are somewhat structured, right? Like, what you're selling. Like if you're selling a pharmaceutical drug, there are benefits, there are side effects. It's a domain. You know what you're expecting. A person is something that's like, people are not just one size fits all, right? Like, everyone's different, and you have to treat everyone like they're different, and like everyone's unique. And that's what I like about it, is that I literally have no idea what I'm going to get when I talk to someone. I could get somebody who's super pleasant, perfect for the role, or I could get the complete opposite. So I don't know until I go into that conversation, and that's what keeps it fun.
Were there any cases where you actually really liked the candidate and you thought that he is a good fit for the position, but he got declined? What do you do in these cases? Do you save that candidate for later, or?
Yeah. I always try to keep a solid relationship with somebody, even if they weren't a fit for the role. If the candidate, if they, this actually happened today. I felt like this person was really good, but they're just literally too junior for the role and too junior for the candidate or for the hiring manager. So I either write an email or I'll call or I'll do both, just to say, hey, let's connect on LinkedIn. If you see any other roles that you're interested in, please reach out. I'd love to help. Love to see you at Takeda, even if it's not in my group. So that happens all the time. There's only so many roles to go around, and that, if somebody's interested in joining the company, I'd love to see them there. And I never take it personal. It's more like, hey, if you have this experience, just like if I went for like a senior director role, I probably wouldn't be qualified, because I have 10 years of experience, not like 20, and that's really what it takes. So, I'd rather keep a solid relationship with someone, because I think the longer play is, if they're going to be good here or somewhere, then maybe keeping that relationship will help me later down the line.
Is there any difference for you if you close a lot of positions during the month or not, in terms of pay? What is your motivation for this?
Well, my salary isn't based upon like how many placements I have. That was more at like Aerotech. So that's a big difference between an agency recruiter and a corporate recruiter. At an agency, the more people you place, or the higher the spread is what they call it. So basically, the more money you'll make, essentially. But in corporate recruiting, you could hire one person in a month and it could still be successful, because maybe that maybe it was just a slow month, or maybe that role was like an executive role. We don't necessarily track how many people we hire. It's more time to fill. It's more about how quickly you can hire someone. And a lot of things just kind of are invisible, pipelining people or holding on to people that are solid candidates for future opportunities. That's something that isn't necessarily measured, but can show up later on.
If you don't have a strict Boolean limitation for a hard skill, would you go more for the attitude or the skills?
Depends. There's so many. I mean, if it's a lab position where
not a tech job.
Oh, not a tech job. I think I look for soft skills first, because I want to know if somebody's going to be humble. I want to know if they're going to have a low ego. I want to know if they're going to be capable of learning without taking things personal. That's my personal take, because if somebody's going to like have a big ego, or if they're going to have a problem working with other people, then it's going to be a problem for the group, and no one wants that. Like I would rather have somebody that is teachable than somebody who thinks that they know everything that needs to go into that job, right? So I look for soft skills before I look for like the technical skills, if that's not necessarily a hard requirement.
What was the most significant challenge you've recently faced?
It's kind of going back to so I had a top candidate that was going for a particular role, and we had a backup candidate that was also very, very promising. So we didn't want to let the B candidate go, because we didn't know what the A candidate was gonna say, or how they were going to approach the offer. So I told the B candidate, hey, hang tight. We don't have an answer yet, and or basically like, hang tight. Let's talk in a week, because I need more time, because we have another candidate that we're considering. The A candidate I gave an offer to, and they declined, and then so we have to like go back to the B candidate, but the B candidate had 2 offers that they were waiting on. They're like sitting on these 2 offers. So I'm putting a stop on their decision and possibly losing an offer from another company. So I have to move fast to get answers from candidate A. And if they accept, I cut loose candidate B. If they decline, you go back to candidate B, you get an offer before they have to make an offer or make a decision for these other offers. And luckily, they accepted our offer with like a day to spare for these other companies. So it was like literally a beat the clock type of situation. But it worked out. So that's like a typical challenge that like a recruiter will face, especially now when people have multiple offers. But I was just happy that we had a backup, because if we don't have a backup candidate, we're just back to square one, just doing the same thing.
If you deny a candidate, do you care if the candidate writes back to you with a general polite letter like, I'm sorry, but I hope?
Yeah, I mean, it helps. I think it's never easy to like call a candidate to say, hey, you weren't selected for the role, or like, send an email. But if they send an email back, it helps. I know it's not necessary.
Are those emails automated?
Some are, but most of them, like if I decline somebody in Workday, they will get an automated email. Like for somebody who we didn't consider, somebody who's like absolutely not a fit, they'll just get an automated message. Somebody who interviews, I will usually call to say, hey, we're not going to proceed with you. Just again, to save that relationship, to say, hey, we would love to like see you at Takeda at some point. Let's stay connected. But yeah, I mean, if they write back, that's okay. If they don't, that's fine too. I think it's never easy to like hear that you weren't selected for a role, especially if you really, really wanted it. But it's up to them. If somebody just wrote back, hey, I understand, it's okay. Like let's stay connected. That's best case scenario.
How do you grow professionally in this?
A lot of it's time. A lot of it is just experience. I think, like I was talking about, like instinct and gut, like you don't get that from a year or 2 years. I think you have to really have different experiences at different levels. When I started out, a lot of my positions were a lot of like entry level roles, and it was, easy fills. Like they're, hey, somebody right out of school and just explain the role, and you really like understand the way of recruiting. But when you get into these, senior director level positions or VP positions, those are true leaders, and there's only a small bucket of these people. So you really have to go out and find these people. You really have to dive deep into what the benefits of working here are, and you really have to do true talent acquisition work to get to that level. That's how you grow. I think having good leadership has been a benefit for me, and something that I've not taken for granted, but I've had really good leaders and managers that have helped push me. So that's been helpful too. I think having a good manager and just getting exposed to different skill sets is helpful.
So after you complete your interview with a person, he goes to other instances in your company. Do you usually hear back from them after they go through the whatever layers you have in a company? Or are you a single shot interview? You just yes or no, and they never come back to you?
No, I mean, it depends. Like sometimes we have these candidates that, that they'll come to different roles at Takeda. Like if I decline somebody for a certain role at Takeda and I call them and say, hey, like, let's stay connected. Sometimes I'll get emails, or a lot of the times I'll just get emails saying, hey, I'm interested in this role. Do you mind helping me out with connecting me with the recruiter? And I will. Or I'll just send their resume to the recruiter and say, hey, we interviewed them. They weren't selected, but they're still good. So recruiters are really good about networking with one another, especially internally. We want to help each other out because it makes our jobs a lot easier to know all these steps have been done already. So let's save some time and try to help serve this person that really wants to be at Takeda or wherever it might be.
Is it fine for you when people reach out to you directly through LinkedIn, those who don't know you at all, you've never talked to them? Is that a standard practice, and you don't just drop them off? Or you have to reply to each one? What is the science behind that?
Yeah, it depends. I mean, I try to get to everyone. I think it's not always easy. I think it depends on how ingrained in my work I am. Sometimes I'm on LinkedIn every day. Sometimes I can't be on LinkedIn because I'm just so busy with like offers or, doing recruiter things. But yeah, I mean, I try to at least respond to people, but it's not always like immediate unless it's like for a position that I'm actively working on.
Would you encourage people to do that?
Yeah. I think it's one way to connect. I don't think every recruiter is as involved with LinkedIn. But I think it doesn't hurt, especially if you're interested in a company or interested in a role. I mean, it's just one avenue. It doesn't hurt is what I would say. But sometimes it can be a guessing game because you might be reaching out to recruiters that have nothing to do with your skill set. And that happens a lot to me where, I don't work on software engineer roles, but I have software engineers reach out to me and I say, hey, thanks for reaching out. I'd love to connect, but I can't really help you because I don't work on that skill set. So sometimes it's just like, from a candidate standpoint, just like taking a shot at maybe this recruiter can help me, maybe they can't. So maybe be strategic about, who you're trying to connect with and who you're reaching out to, because then it saves you time and it saves the recruiter some time too, knowing that they can help you with that skill set.
But from the perspective of a person who's looking for a job in a particular company, you don't always know if that recruiter is responsible for the particular job opening. How do you navigate that?
Sometimes it's obvious in the recruiter's title. Like for my title, it says, Takeda Oncology. So if you see something that has oncology in the title, I might be the recruiter. Just like if in the title it says, or even if it's a smaller company, it's probably really easy to identify. Working at a 100-person company, there's probably only one recruiter and maybe like 2 or 3 people in HR. So it's kind of easy to narrow it down. At bigger companies, you have to be kind of strategic about, all right, what's their title? Maybe it has certain skill sets that they support. And then you can reach out to those people to say, hey, I saw you support this skill set. I have that skill set. Do you want to have a conversation? Or even say like, hey, I applied to this position. Are you working on this or can you help me out? Sometimes that can help. But again, it's not always a guarantee that recruiter is going to be exactly what you're looking for.
So jumping back on the review process, you've mentioned that you don't care if the CV is short or long.
No, I mean, I think for some people it's just going to be long. Like PhDs right out of school, they're going to have publications, they're going to have sightings, they're going to have a lot on their resume. Like if it's less than 3 pages, I would be really surprised. Unless they wanted to condense it down. But I think if it gets the point across in 2 pages, then that's perfect. Like my personal resume is probably 2 pages. But I think the longer you've been in the industry, the more likely you're going to have a longer resume, and that's okay. I think somebody right out of school, if you have like 1.5 pages, that's probably enough.
And for those who have 8 years of experience, 10.
Yeah, 2 to 3, 3 or 4, that's pretty standard. But again, like I've seen a lot of like MD resumes, PharmD resumes where you have these rotations that maybe you could put on there, or research. There's so many different ways that you can take a resume, and I think the higher the education, the more you're probably going to put on your resume. But there's CVs and there's resumes. CVs are going to be way more detailed. Resumes are going to be a condensed version of that, and I think both are okay. I think it just depends on the style of the candidate.
What about cover letters?
I don't read them, to be honest. In some cases it's okay. So for some writing positions where writing is very involved, the hiring manager likes to see a cover letter because they like to see how they format. Are there spelling errors? Are there formatting errors? So it kind of gives them a preview of, okay, this is like a little sample of what a writing sample would look like. Other than that, I do not read cover letters. I appreciate that people put them together. I know they're tedious. I have put together cover letters myself, and I do not like it. I will say I love resumes. Just tell me the hard skills. Tell me what your experience has been. I know your intentions are to apply to this particular role, and I don't need a cover letter to tell me that because you're applying to it, So I know like a lot of people, if they hear that I'm not reading their cover letter, I know they might not like that. But I know that there are probably other recruiters that do read cover letters, but I'm very much interested in the experience itself, and what they've been doing.
How about people with multi-industry experience? I know it's not applicable much to the pharmaceutical industry, but if you might have heard some stories, or I'm an example of a person who shifted from business, economics, management to computer science. And not everybody's clearly happy about it because most of all, most of the job openings, they look for Boolean matches. So they need a tech person who has X amount of years of experience, who is not a shifter from another industry.
Sure.
What do you think of those? Did you have those people?
I have. I actually had a neighbor that I helped find a job at Pfizer. They were a microbiologist, and then they switched to carpentry. Completely different. And they did it for maybe 1 or 2 years. And I asked him about it. I was like, so like the manager is kind of curious about this, and I'm kind of curious about this because I had no idea you were a microbiologist until I saw your resume. And he said it was just something he really wanted to do, and he did it, and he enjoyed the skills that he learned from it, but he loves being a microbiologist, and he'd love to get back to it, and he was very genuine about it. And he ended up getting the job as a microbiologist, and that was a very different swing from industry to industry. And sometimes it's okay. Sometimes, like you said, sometimes it's kind of like frowned upon, but I think it also depends on the role. Like if you look at an executive assistant, it's okay if you work at Google and then go to Takeda because you just understand what it's like to work with a leader, somebody who has, a lot of responsibilities, and you need to be that right-hand person to make sure that they're staying organized. And I think if you have that type of skill, it doesn't really matter what industry you're in. I think it just matters more about the person and how organized they are. So I think depending on the role, going from a scientist at Pharma to a scientist at like oil and gas, I think that there can be things that transition, but they're very different. Like the purpose behind both of those industries are very, very different. So it can be it can be harder, I think, because then you're competing with other people that have stayed in pharma. So then you're really going to have a good personality to be like, all right, hey, I know I switched, but I'd love to come back to pharma, or whatever it might be. So I think it just depends. But I think overall, I think it can be okay. Just depending on the role.
Would you recommend turning the light down on that past experience if you have shifted, and turning the light on more, emphasizing on the new industry that you're in?
I think I think I would be more curious to have a conversation with the person, because I'm a very curious person about people's experience, and I think that's why I like recruiting. But I would be more interested in learning about like why they wanted to make that switch, and what motivated them to do that. So that way I can express to the hiring manager, hey, they made the switch for X. I see a lot of people move to a different state because of family, and then they have to switch industries because of that, because pharma in Massachusetts is a hub. It's possibly the biggest hub of biotech and pharma in the world. And if you move to, I don't know, Ohio, there might not be as much. So you naturally have to.
No offense to Ohio.
No offense. Yeah, no offense to Ohio. But they might have other industries that we don't have here, or they might just not have a lot of pharma.
What about other cultures? There is a disclaimer, of course, to almost any job description that it's an equal opportunity employer, whatever. But when it comes down to reviewing applicants, what's your story?
I mean, I love people because they're people, not because of their gender or religion or sexual orientation, like all that. I know what you're talking about.
So that does not impact in any way.
No, I mean, if somebody's qualified for a role, like I wish, so there was actually, there are practices that are done at companies where you'll look at a resume, you'll take away the name, you'll take away certain aspects of the resume to make it look just like the resume, and you don't have biases towards gender or any of that, to basically understand why people go towards other candidates or another. And in a particular example, somebody went to a state college and another person went to an Ivy League college. And everyone went to the Ivy League college person because it wasn't Ivy League, it was like a state school versus a university, like UMass versus Worcester. And everyone went towards UMass because they felt like it was a better university. But when the unconscious bias is basically saying that this person went to a better university because they are better educated, rather than the person who went to the state college because they couldn't afford to go to UMass. So it's understanding that, like understanding your unconscious biases and helping that with your recruiting can be helpful. But everyone is prone to unconscious bias. Like I think from the way that we grow up, from the way that we live our lives, I think it's a big part of what we have to recognize as recruiters, is that it doesn't matter if it's a woman, man, Asian, Latino, white, black, it doesn't matter. Like it just needs to be the person.
Often on job descriptions, you can see a phrase that the candidate has to align perfectly with the values of the company, with the mission and the values of the company. How do you interpret that?
I think it comes back to like patient-centric. Like if your purpose around pharma anyway, if you are a patient-focused person, I think that you meet the values. But that can be, that can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people, because I think values of any pharma company is probably going to be that, right? But if you are really motivated by money, and like that's your purpose in finding a job, I mean that is a purpose, maybe a secondary purpose, but like your main purpose needs to be like, hey, this is what we do and this is what we believe in. And if you don't believe in that, that's fine, but like we're here for the patients and we want to help them in a certain way. But analyzing that in like an interview can come out in different ways. Like if somebody is like says like, hey, I'm really only here for the money, which doesn't happen. But if they did, then it might trigger something for the managers to be like, okay, like I appreciate the honesty, but we need somebody who's here for more than that. So I think that's also where interviews come in, and we also are able to assess, what people are really there for.
So if the person tells you straight up front that he's here for the money mainly, that is a red flag for you. A yellow flag.
Yeah, yellow flag. I mean, if somebody said that to me straight up on a call, which I don't think has ever happened, but in some ways, like in like secondary ways, people will say that. In some roles where it's like, hey, how much money can I make? Or like, what's the salary? And that's like a main question. It's like, okay, like this is the salary, but like, what do you think about the role? There's different ways of assessing that in an interview or a phone screen. But it doesn't happen a lot.
Is that a bad thing?
Yes, it is. if somebody,
But most of the people, they're looking for a job to earn money.
sure,
Of course, it's awesome if you get your dream job and you're doing what you love. But that phrase is particularly inclining that you have to love what you do in order to get this job.
true. But you also have to be like technically good, right? Like you have to be.
No, what I'm saying is that if you're technically good and you have the skills, hard skills, and you're here for the money because you know you're good,
Sure.
then that makes it a bad thing then if you want to come and get the money.
It's not, well, I see what you're saying. Yeah. So it's not necessarily a bad thing that you want to make more money because everyone wants to make more money. Like sometimes when I do negotiations with people and I say like, and people are like, hey, this is kind of a tricky question because I don't want to like outprice myself. And I say, yeah, if I can pay you $1 million, I will. Like, it doesn't have to be an awkward thing. Like it's, everyone has their standards. I think that's part of the reason why I'm so transparent, and other recruiters are very transparent about like, hey, this is the range of what we're looking for, or what we can pay for this position. But if you're outside of this range, like I'd love to know because I don't want to waste your time. And that's why I'm so transparent, because I don't want to make the whole conversation about money. I want to make the conversation about, what the role entails and what they're looking for. And if money is something that they want to talk about, then yeah, we have to talk about it anyway. But if they make it like a main focal point, it's, it can be a yellow flag for sure. Not a red, like you said, it's not a red flag. It's more of like a yellow flag to be like, all right, like what's their main purpose here?
How should the candidate approach the topic of relocation if that is specifically not described?
Sure. It's, it's worth it just to ask, just to say like, hey, is there a relocation package offered? And that's totally fine.
So it won't hurt asking that. Okay.
No. Because like worst case scenario, you could just say, no, like, unfortunately we can't. Like, are you still able to relocate without a relocation package? Because again, that's more understanding what their possibility of moving would be. Because a lot of people, a lot of people have families, a lot of people own homes, a lot of people like aren't just packing up a suitcase and moving, right? And some people are. Some people just like live month to month and they're just waiting to find that next role and they can just move wherever. But a lot of times I talk to people who have families and it's not just them they're making a decision for, it's their family. Like it's their kids and they have to think about, what the school year is like and when they can move and when a good transition for everyone would be. Like that's a little more complex, but that's why it's important to cover those in a call.
What if you don't get candidates on, let's just imagine the situation that you don't get candidates for a job posting. You start hunting for people. How does that happen?
Well, sometimes we'll use Hired Score, like we were talking about, like when we look at candidates that have applied to Takeda in the past. And other times we'll use LinkedIn, like LinkedIn Recruiter, using Boolean searches or using key terms to make sure that we're looking for the right people. Other times we'll look at like search firms, like an agency, like an Aerotech, and we'll say, hey, this is what we're looking for. Can you help us? And they'll require a fee of like, a certain percentage for the candidate to be placed. So if somebody's placed, then we owe them a fee. Those are usually the main things that we'll have. But we also have, like on my team, we have a sourcer or somebody who like goes out and like looks for people and they're with the team. We don't have to like outreach to another company to do that. So It just depends. Like some companies, like I said, smaller companies, they might have one person that they rely on, so they have to do everything, or go to a search firm.
When you perform your search on LinkedIn by a Boolean search, as you said, do you know if, let's assume an example, that a person is a good project manager. He does not have that skill, but he has that as a description in his past experience. Do you know if you'll be able to see him as a match of a piece of a description, not as a skill separate?
Right. I think sometimes you would have to have that conversation with somebody, because if it's from a past experience, like you said, like a Boolean search will only pick up on people who have certain key terms
In skills,
and skills.
not past experience.
Oh yeah. Yeah, I would have to like dig deeper. Because sometimes they put it in skills just expecting people to know like this is just what I've done like throughout my career. But if I don't see PMP certification, or if I'm not really seeing it in their resume, it might just be something worth digging in on when I'm talking to them. But if it's a skill and not necessarily an experience, then it could be just something that they put in their experience. Like technically, like I'm a project manager, like every rec is a project, but I'm not a project manager. Like that's not like my title. But yeah, I would have to dig. That's why we have to do so many calls as recruiters, is because there's so many unknowns from a resume or a profile that sometimes digging in is necessary.
Did you have experience where software misjudged a candidate?
Yeah, hired score. They'll sometimes they'll grade an A for somebody who's like not really qualified. Like they maybe overqualified, or maybe they're like kind of on the right track, but it's like, no, they're not really a fit. So yeah, sometimes, not all the time. Like it's a really good software for sure. I think it's just sometimes it doesn't always hit the right number, but 95% of the time they do.
Did you have candidates that you reached out to that were located maybe in another country, even if you're looking for higher executives or
Yeah.
top positions? How does that look like?
Sometimes, so Takeda is a global company. So we have people in Singapore, France, Italy, Spain, Japan. There's a ton of people in Japan because that's where the headquarters is. So we'll have internal candidates come from other parts of the world, and the visa situation can be different for somebody who works internally. But yeah, I think it depends. So like depends on the role. Like you said, like if it's an executive and we need to look for somebody outside, then we can be more flexible around like what we can offer for sponsorship. If we offer an international relocation, it can be tricky with compensation, because going from say like the euro to the US dollar, it's not apples to apples. We don't have universal healthcare here. So we might pay more, but more comes out of taxes in a country that has universal healthcare because everyone gets it, right? So it's not apples to apples, and it's complex sometimes, but yeah, it doesn't happen all the time. Most of the time we can find candidates in the US, but on occasion, yeah, we go outside to like, other continents.
How was that experience when the pandemic hit and suddenly most of your interviews are now by Zoom?
Yeah.
What was that change like?
It was swift. It was March 20th, 2020, I think, or at least it was that week. But yeah, we went from everything in person to everything through Teams or Zoom type of calls. So it was very different. But it's also convenient, and I think the silver lining of it is that companies found a way to find flexibility around considering people outside of Massachusetts or like wherever their like current location was. So when I was at Pfizer, we really focused on people who were like close by. And we really didn't have a problem finding people for the most part that were local, and we could still offer relocations for people, and we could still fly people in for interviews. But this opened up a whole different door to say, all right, well, if we're already doing webinars or if we're already doing, Zoom interviews, then why don't we just open it up to people who are outside of here? Let's look at University of Michigan. Let's look at UCLA. Let's look at Florida. So it opened up a different avenue. But it was clunky at first. I think the admins that were supporting the scheduling of the interviews, they were like, how do we do this? How do I schedule all of this? But we figured it out. But that was definitely a stressful time for everyone. That was just like one piece of the stress for everyone during COVID anyway.
But you say it was convenient at the same time.
It was very convenient. Yeah.
Saved you time on.
Tons of time. Yeah. And not having to schedule travel for somebody to come from, California to Massachusetts, have them stay a night and then fly. There's a lot of conveniences about, having somebody like be able to just do a Teams call. And I do that now. Like Takeda, we don't really do in-person interviews now. And we could, but it's very convenient to have somebody, just be able to do a call, even if they are in Massachusetts. I think to make it a fair and equitable process for everyone, if we have two people that are local that could technically come in, but you have one person that's not local, to have two people come in and then have somebody else do a Teams call, that's not equitable to everyone. And we might have a bias towards the people that we saw in person. So that's something that we have to keep in mind too as recruiters. But it's way more convenient, way more efficient this way.
But it is a different thing because you don't see the interactions, you don't see the body language, you don't.
That's the trade-off. I know.
What would your advice be for the candidates who will go through Zoom interviews? What is the general strategy in order not to screw up?
Same deal. Like, be on time, be professional, dress professionally, and just be curious. I think that's the biggest thing. It's just be curious about the role, ask questions, come prepared with questions, be engaged. I can't tell you, this doesn't happen all the time, but there are some calls where it's like pulling teeth. It's like, do you really want to be here? Do you want to talk to me? Do you want to work here? But the people who are engaged and the people who ask questions and the people who genuinely feel or show that they're interested in a role are the people that are more likely to go forward. So just like when you show up to a real interview, that's important for me to see and important for the hiring managers to see.
How would you describe an interview that you enjoy?
Oh man. When I can talk to somebody that is easy to talk to, and it's either about the work responsibilities or not about the work responsibilities. I think for me, I look for the personality of the person, and I really, really feel good about hiring somebody that if I can get along with them, most likely everyone, because I get along with everyone, so it's probably easier for me. But like I want to know that if I can get along with this person, they're probably going to get along with their manager and their other team, and that helps morale overall. That's my favorite kind of interview. Somebody that I can just kind of like shoot the shit with, like to, be frank. Like I want somebody that I can just kind of have a conversation with and feel good about, but also bring it back to the work and just understand that like, hey, I know that we're here to talk about work, but knowing that like you're a good human being and like you want to be here and like you're a good person, that makes me feel good. And it makes me feel like the interview is going to go well.
Yes, but you have to keep in mind that most people don't do interviews on a regular basis. It's your job.
Yep.
It's what you do. But it may be awkward and weird and scary for other people.
I know.
And do you account for that always?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. And that's why I say it's my favorite. Like my favorite are the ones that can handle the pressure in a way that they can make it kind of fun. And I know that that's not the case for everyone, like including myself. Like I have gone on interviews where I am so nervous. Like I told you, my first interview out of college was so bad. And I cringe just thinking about it because I know how awkward it must have been for my manager to interview me, because I literally locked eyes with her and I don't think I blinked the entire time. But now I'm so used to it where when I was interviewing at Takeda, I knew that I was going to talk to very extroverted, like people in HR and people who are recruiters are really easy to talk to. So it puts me at ease, knowing that I'm going to have to talk to people that are very similar to me. But also talk to leaders that aren't necessarily recruiters, but understanding, it's good to read the room. It's good to understand, what they're okay with, what they're not okay with, and just kind of like go with the flow. But yeah, understanding that not everyone's going to have that kind of interview is totally fine. And just because somebody isn't like able to have like a super like casual conversation with me for the first 5 minutes, that's fine. I think certain skill sets are going to bring out certain things with people. Like if people work with computers all day and not working with people all the time, I don't expect them to just be super gregarious. I think they're going to be people who are used to being on a computer and not around a lot of people. So it's like, it might be clunky and that's okay. As long as you get through it and you handle the pressure okay.
When you're done with the candidate, when you're done with the interview, by the end of the interview, you know if they pass or fail your stage, right?
Yeah.
Do you tell them straight away if they pass?
No, because it might be a pass or fail for me, but it might not be a pass or fail for the team. So it's very, very much a team effort to make a hire. It might be a pass or fail initially. Like if you're talking about like a phone screen, I would know pretty initially if they're going to be a yes or a no. There are a lot of maybes where I would send a candidate to a manager just to be like, hey, this conversation went pretty well, but here are some of the things that I'm concerned about. If you still want to talk to them, let's talk to them. If you're concerned about it, then let's move on. After an official interview, it's very, very much a team effort. You have 4 to 6, maybe 7 people that are talking to this person, and you might get 6 yeses and 1 no. Or you might get the opposite. You might get 6 no's and 1 yes. So you just have to talk to the team about what those red flags are or green flags and then go from there. You know, best case scenario, you have 3 really, really good candidates and it's a hard decision to make, but you have 3 really good candidates and it's not the opposite. Maybe you have 3 really bad candidates and it's like, okay, now we have to start at square one. And I shouldn't even say bad. I should say like they're candidates that you don't feel really, really good about. And then you have to go back to square one. But yeah, that's what I would say. I think that having a collective answer from the team is helpful because then it feels good to me to know that everyone collectively said, yes, let's definitely go with this candidate. And then I can make an offer and everyone feels good about hiring them. You know, no one feels good about saying like, yeah, I kind of felt okay about this candidate, but we don't really have anyone else. So we have to make an offer. Then it's like, all right, do you want to just go back to square one? Because I'd rather have somebody you feel really good about hiring because that's my reputation. Like my reputation is based on, you know, how long this person is going to last in the role, how effective they're going to be, what their quality of work is, because that represents me as a recruiter. If I'm pushing for somebody that doesn't end up being a good employee, then that's my, like a little bit of my legacy. You know, those are the people that I put forth to a company that has a lot of important work to do. So yeah, that's what I would say.
Did you have a lot of people who quit?
Like that I personally hire?
Yeah.
Probably. Unfortunately,
I mean in the short-term period after you just bought them.
I don't think so. So I hired, when I was at Pfizer, I hired over 400 people. And unfortunately, the downside to recruiting is you see a lot of the front end and you don't see a lot of the back end unless you're on site. You know, I would hire people in Missouri, Connecticut, North Carolina, and a lot in Massachusetts. And I sat in Andover and I got to see a lot of people in person where I could see them on a pretty regular basis. So I could see them grow and I could see them stay with the company. And if somebody's with a company for more than like 2-3 years, I feel like they're probably doing a good job. But if somebody quits pretty immediately, then that's too bad. You know, that's unfortunate for the candidate and for the hiring manager to experience that too.
So if you have 6 no's and 1 yes, you still negotiate with the team until you come to a conclusion of moving forward, or is it an automatic drop if it's more than half?
Most likely an automatic drop. I wouldn't say that it's an automatic drop every time, but most likely, yeah. Because if that 1 yes is the hiring manager that really wants to hire that person, they ultimately have the say. But that should be like at least a little bit of a red flag to be like, hey, 6 people are saying no, there's probably a reason for it. But yeah, so most of the time, if that's the case where it's 6 out of 7 saying no, it's probably going to be a no. Just like if you have 6 yeses and 1 no, and that no is the hiring manager, you know, I guess I would be curious why. You know, that would be like that would be a rare occasion. But yeah, that's something that I would say. Yeah, debriefs are extremely important to the decision-making process because everyone should have a say and their voice should be heard.
But your voice is the first to be heard.
Pretty much, yeah.
So you're the one who technically gets the opportunity to make the shots, the initial ones.
The initial ones, yeah, the ones that get to move forward. But it's still the hiring manager. So it's very much the recruiter initially, and then the hiring manager gets to say. But the recruiter absolutely has an influence on what goes on. If the recruiter says, hey, I feel really good about this person. I think they're missing X, Y, Z, but they have A, B, C. I think it's worth a conversation, and I think I'd love to set up a call. And sometimes I'll just even set up a call before they even have the chance to respond back, just as a cue to say, hey, these people are really good. Let's talk. So yeah, the recruiter absolutely has a very initial influence that can cascade into an offer.
From the eyes of a candidate, you're going for the interview. As you said, you don't tell what are the results. But what is your experience, body language, phrases that drop out when you see that it's not going to work out? But
for me, I really want somebody to be genuine. I think that the pharma industry is something that isn't really something I take for granted, and I don't think the people that are in the pharma industry that take for granted. I think that if you're genuine and you are able to connect pretty easily, I think that's a very big green flag for me. I love it when people connect, and I think that if people can be vulnerable and speak from experience and can draw from experiences to say what their purpose is, then that's a big yes for me. On top of the technical skills, like if you can do all of that and then have the technical aspect of what we're looking for, that's huge for me. Because I want somebody to be able to be relatable and somebody who has a genuine purpose in being there. And that's really something that's important for me, especially initially when somebody's like applying to a job. And even if that's not like a huge purpose, like you don't have to have, personal experience with cancer to feel like, this is also a purpose that I feel was important to me. You can just say like, I really like this industry and I want to be a part of something that can help me change somebody's life. That's enough, like I think that is enough for me to say like, this person is genuine. This person really wants to make a difference in someone's life, regardless of what that is. That's a big plus for me.
what I meant more is that if you engage in an interview and you see that it's not going as well as you thought,
Sure.
what are the indications from your side as a recruiter that it's not going good? How can a candidate predefine that he's in some sort of trouble?
That's a good question. I haven't really had a lot of those. I think if somebody is not answering the questions, so again, this doesn't happen all the time, but sometimes you'll ask a question and they won't answer you directly, or they'll kind of like beat around the bush. Like I like it when people are direct.
No, I mean, you conduct an interview, and during that process, you evaluate the person.
Yeah.
And by the end of the interview, you understand, closer to the end of the interview, you understand that he's probably not going to be a fit. It's a no. Do you give any hints to the candidate, and how do you do it?
Sure.
And what is the body language and what's the chemistry there?
Understood. Sorry.
Yeah.
So when I'm talking to a candidate and I know that they're not a fit, I will tell them like, hey, this is what we're really looking for, and you don't have X, Y, Z. But unfortunately, like we'll still pursue other candidates, and I'll be straight up with them initially, and say like, hey, I'd love to still keep that connection if it's going okay, like if they're being genuine and everything. But if they're really not a fit, I will just tell them immediately and just say like, hey, unfortunately, like you're not a fit. I'd love to stay in contact, but I'll disposition you. You'll get an automated message. But, if you have any other position that you apply to, I'd love to stay connected, as long as they're a good candidate.
Coming back when you started in this profession, is this something you wish you knew before you began your journey as a recruiter?
I think I took for granted the impact that a recruiter can have. I think that's also why I like working at a company, is because I think I have a true seat at the table. And I wasn't necessarily feeling that from the agency side. And I think that agencies are super important for the recruiting process, but I enjoy literally sitting at a table like this with leaders and supporting them and truly getting their opinion. And I think I took that for granted early on when I was at Aerotech, because I felt like I'm just an accessory, like I feel like I'm just here just to kind of help as needed, but not really making a difference. But I did. I mean, I think I took for granted the impact that I made on the candidate's life, because there were people that were like really struggling that needed help and needed a job just to pay the rent. And making a difference in a candidate's life is just as important as making a difference in a company's well-being or like a group's well-being. So I think both are extremely impactful. And I think I took that for granted when I first started at Aerotech. And I think for people who are considering being a recruiter, I think that is the impact that you can have on an individual's life. Is you don't know what somebody's struggling with, because maybe they really don't like their job, or maybe they don't have a job and they need a job to survive. So I think, that's obviously an extreme case. But it happened, it happened when I was at Aerotech, where I could help people get a job when they were jobless and they had a family to feed and they couldn't. Or maybe they were just on unemployment or something like that helped them get by, but they weren't excelling. And, that was something that helped me understand the impact that I could have on somebody's life, even if it wasn't from a company directly. Helping somebody get a job when they were like down low is something that I really appreciate.
And that's the main source of motivation.
That's a big motivator. Yeah. Helping people get to where they want to be, helping people reach their career goals, while making an impact on other people's lives is a huge motivator for me.
And what do you think of career fairs?
They can be helpful. I think it's good exposure for companies. It's good exposure for candidates. I mentioned sweaty handshakes before. There are a ton of sweaty handshakes, so many sweaty handshakes. And that's why there's always like hand sanitizer around. But there's that it's good to connect with people. It's a good way of having human interaction. And that's something that I don't take for granted. And something, especially what COVID taught us, is that we were taken away from so many human interactions, and career fairs can help us with that. But especially like, interns, new grads, I think they're great. I think there are other career fairs for professionals that are in their, later in their career. Those can also be helpful, or conferences. But yeah, it's good exposure. I love human interaction, so I'm all about career fairs.
Even if they're sweaty?
Even if they're sweaty handshakes, it's okay. I know people get nervous.
Do you prefer any particular platforms to look for people to post jobs, or is that not your vote? For example, there are a lot of them: Glassdoor, LinkedIn, Indeed,
Sure.
ZipRecruiter.
So everyone comes through Workday. So if you applied through any of those platforms, it should come to the careers page. So we'll all see it through Workday. I don't have to look at other career sites to necessarily do that. I like LinkedIn. I think LinkedIn is a great source for recruiters to look for people, especially when somebody applies. You can look at their LinkedIn and see kind of where they're at in their career outside of their resume. But people will apply directly through the careers page, and that's usually what I see. I also like to see when people are referred by people at the company. That sometimes helps because they can vouch for the people. But Workday is our ATS, and that's where everyone comes through. But I like LinkedIn. Indeed isn't bad. Career Builder I haven't really used in a long time. But I know Indeed is pretty popular too. So any of them really work.
What would your advice be on building a CV and building a resume?
I think for students, use your career centers, because those are going to be really, really good resources. I think a resume is easier to read, but both are very valuable. I think a CV can also be really valuable, especially for somebody who has a ton of publications, a ton of research, like a PhD student, I think would be like the perfect candidate to have a CV, but I like to read resumes because they're easier to read and they're more about the experience of the candidate as opposed to the research.
Does that imply that resumes, they inherently have more text, more description? They go in deep into details?
I think CVs actually go deeper into the details, but I think both are valuable. I think either one, whichever direction somebody wanted to go, if it was CV or resume, I think they'd be okay.
When you see a candidate on LinkedIn, do you look at his activity in terms of posts?
Not necessarily. I think when I connect with someone, I can see what people are posting, and most of the time I've seen pretty everything's pretty based around their job. I guess I haven't run into anything too like unprofessional, but I know what happens. But yeah, it would probably influence. Like if somebody did do that, I think it would influence my impression of like how much they're going to ruffle feathers, I guess, like if it was unprofessional. But I don't think that, luckily I haven't run into it too much.
You've mentioned in a private conversation that you are a single parent. How did that experience influence your job?
Helps me time manage really well. I've been a single parent for a little over a year now, and it's been, eye-opening to other single parents. I think that it was something I took for granted until I became a single parent. And I think that managing your time between, I split time with my kids, and splitting time between having my kids and what my work days look like when I have my kids is different from when I don't have my kids. When I don't have my kids, I can work a little bit later if I have to. If I have my kids, I really have to, condense my time and make sure that I'm covering my bases and making sure that I'm serving the candidates that I support too. So yeah, it's a big way to have different time management. It can be difficult sometimes, but I think, it works. My company is extremely understanding, and I hope for other single parents, their companies are also understanding too.
For those eager to dive into your profession, what would your advice be?
I would say if you are a natural connector of people, you're going to be great, and just give it time. I think the biggest frustration that I had early on was just not placing a lot of people. And that was frustrating to me because I wanted to make an impact on somebody's life. And if I wasn't doing that because I just didn't understand the skill set, that was frustrating. But if you dive in and you really soak in that information and just really take like that first 3 to 6 months to really just get to know your field, I think you'll be okay. And as long as your focus is on other people and what you can offer to them, and also help yourself professionally in the time being, I think you'll be great. But just be patient. I think that's the biggest thing.
Anthony, thank you for your time.
Thanks
it was
for having
a pleasure speaking to you today. You have an amazing story, an amazing job, and I hope you will continue to help other people.
Yeah, appreciate you having me.